Our special council and planning commission
Recording in
session.
progress.
And recording is in progress. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Good morning. I will call roll of City Council first and then the Planning Commission. Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez, not yet present. Councilmember Snedden?
Here.
Councilmember Friedman, not present. Mayor Pro Tem Harmon?
Here.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez?
Present.
Councilmember Jordan?
Here.
And Mayor Rouse?
Here.
And Planning Commission, Chair Escobedo?
Here.
Vice Chair Bonderson?
Here.
Member Balky?
Here.
Member Higgins is not present. Member Lodge?
Here.
Member Wardlow?
Here.
And Member Wiscombe?
Here.
All right, thank you very much. I've been informed by the clerk that there are no changes to the agenda. So we will move forward. Chair Escobedo and I both have an opening statement to make to kind of define what we're doing here today, and then we'll move on. So today we're here jointly to get a report and to catch up on what's going on with our planning department, along with Planning Commission. And we're focused on establishing the updated goals for the city's housing element. The staff will provide an overview of the state's requirement for an updating housing element and the process and timeline to complete the work by February 2023. The purpose of having this discussion as a joint meeting is to allow council to hear directly from our land use advisory body, Planning Commission, on making recommended goals for housing for the next 8 years. After the public comments on the draft goals, the Planning Commission will provide input to the council, and the council will vote to adopt the goals for the 2023 housing element. And I'd like to have Chair Escobedo make an opening statement as well, please.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. So the Planning Commission got an opportunity last week to preview the draft goals during our meeting for the environmental impact report for the updated housing element and climate action plan. PC also designated myself and Commissioner Wiscombe to work closely with staff over the next few months to develop more detailed policies and programs that follow the adopted goals. So the purpose of today's meeting is really to finalize these goals and not get too much into the policy work. We will have another opportunity in the future to do that. Thank you, Mayor Ross.
Very good, thank you. And so we will go ahead and proceed with the staff report, and then we'll follow that with public comment. So, Ms. Brooke, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse and council members and Chair Escobedo and planning commissioners. Happy to be here this morning. It's nice to be in person. When we do these joint meetings, it's been a little while. It's good to see everybody in person. So with those opening remarks, I will get right into the staff presentation. So why are we here? Well, our first housing element for the city was adopted in 1977. We've had various housing element updates since then. We are nearing the end of our current housing element, which was adopted in 2015. It goes through the beginning of next year. So it's time to update the housing element again. And so we're here to plan for our housing needs in the community through the year 2031. As mentioned specifically today, we are focusing on the housing element goals, which will set the framework for the policies and programs to follow. And then as we want to engage the community as much as possible throughout this process, this hearing is another opportunity to hear from the public and also make everyone aware of how they can be involved throughout the entire process. So today's meeting will run in this order. So after my presentation, Rob Fredericks from the Housing Authority will make some brief remarks. Then we'll go to public comment and then turn it to the council and commission for any questions of staff or others. And then the Planning Commission will provide their input to City Council on the draft goals, with Council ultimately, hopefully, approving our housing element goals for the next 8 years at the end of this meeting. So at first, before we talk about planning for all of our housing units that we need to try to provide over the next 8 years, I want to provide a little bit of background about how those housing units are allocated to us. So this process occurs every 8 years, and it triggers an update to the housing element to plan for these additional units. It starts with the state's review of population forecasts. State HCD is the Housing and Community Development Department of the state government. So once they look at population forecasts and determine our housing needs throughout the state, then they allocate units to each region. And our regional body for that is the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, or SBCAG. SBCAG takes our regional units and, based on methodology, allocates those units to the county and every city within the county. This is called our Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. So once our SBCAG regional body has the number of units that's been allocated to us, we go through a methodology, and SBCAG involved all planning managers throughout the county and the city throughout this process in 2020, 2021, and basically focused on 3 elements to allocate the housing units throughout each agency in the county. First was looking at jobs, both existing and forecasted jobs. And as we know, we have a serious housing jobs imbalance in our county. And so most of the housing units were allocated to agencies that have most of the jobs. So in this case, 60% of our region's units were allocated to the South Coast, where 60% of the jobs exist. Then the next step in the methodology considers overcrowding and cost burden. So those communities that either have serious concerns with overcrowding in housing units, or where the burden to stay in housing requires a significant amount of income, those areas get more housing units. And then finally, on the vacancy rate, in order to have a healthy vacancy rate and allow mobility among residents, we want to try to have vacancy rate closer to 5%, which we haven't seen in probably, I don't know, maybe any of our lifetimes. So for that reason, certain areas within the region got more housing units allocated to try to create a more comfortable vacancy rate. So this is our RHNA for the 6th cycle. You'll hear us talk about the 5th and 6th cycle. So we're currently in the 5th cycle, rounding out the 5th cycle of RHNA. Looking forward to the 6th cycle, it covers the period of June of this year through February of 2031. That's the period that our housing element covers. Here shows our total countywide units of just under 25,000, with the city of Santa Barbara being allocated 8,001 units through the methodology that I previously spoke about. And then just drilling down a little bit further into those 8,001 units, it's also divided by income level. And so you can see here the different income levels from very low to above moderate, and the number of units allocated to each income level. And I'll note here in the little footer, we recently had an updated Santa Barbara County area median income just a couple of weeks ago is now just over $100,000. So that's for a household of 4. Countywide, the area median income is now $100,000. It jumped $10,000 from last year, which is significant. It was $90,000 last year, and I've not seen it jump that high maybe in my career here. So that's pretty telling. Okay, and then I'd like to show just a quick video that is on our website dedicated to the housing element update. I thought it would be fun to hear a little bit from someone, not me. So we're gonna work this out. We had it. And that's not it. Here we go. Are we ready? Okay, we're ready.
California law requires all cities and counties to have a plan for how they will meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. When population forecasts are updated, cities like Santa Barbara need to update their plans based on a specific number and types of housing they need to meet future needs. But what if we don't want to build more housing in Santa Barbara? That's normal. But there are actually a lot of reasons why it's important to meet our community's housing needs. Because of the high cost of housing, it can be challenging for cities across California to provide enough affordable housing for working families, seniors, and young professionals. And our children who grow up here can have a hard time staying in Santa Barbara due to housing affordability. Lack of affordable housing can lead to increased homelessness, overcrowding, and the costs associated with managing its effects on the community. Besides, having enough housing for everybody helps fulfill Santa Barbara's community vision to allow as much housing as possible within resource limits to provide an array of options for all residents. And if we don't get a new housing plan approved, the city could be fined, lose state funding opportunities, lose the ability to issue permits, and in the end, not have a say in where new housing should go. So how many new homes are needed? Based on the state's forecast and the local formula, Santa Barbara needs 8,001 new housing units. Of those, almost half need to be affordable to low and very low income households. The updated housing plan must show the exact locations where future housing can be built and how many homes can be built at each location. So how do we decide where new housing should go? And what are considered good places for new homes? Vacant lots not set aside as open space, sites that are underutilized and need rehabilitation, locations where housing could become more dense than it is today, locations near public transit and essential services like healthcare facilities and neighborhood retail centers, areas where housing could be added to commercial buildings or in business parks, creating live-work neighborhoods. And some cities encourage homeowners to build granny flats on their properties. These are called accessory dwelling units. Before we decide what goes where, we need your help. What criteria are most important to you when thinking about where new housing should be located? The decisions we make over the coming months will shape our community for years to come. Let's work together to make sure Santa Barbara's updated housing plan really is the very best one for our city and our future. For more information, visit www.santabarbaraca.gov/HEU. California law requires all cities and counties to have a plan for how they will meet the
Okay, thank you. Hope you enjoyed the video. Moving on from the video and the little bits of information in there, I want to talk a little bit about what the housing element is. For those who might not be familiar, it's a required part of the general plan. There are 7 required elements of a city's and county's general plan. The housing element is one of them. As it's named, it focuses on housing, whereas the other elements focus on other aspects of our community. It recognizes that housing is a critical need, both in our community and others. It requires us to plan for our housing and especially plan for affordable housing to meet our needs for our citizens here. And it's the only element that's required to undergo periodic updates. As I mentioned, it typically occurs at least every 8 years. The purpose of housing element, as it's a policy document within the general plan, it sets the rules and the programs for how to accommodate housing. And as we know that we significantly need to rely on the private sector to build a lot of our housing, it sets the tone for those private developers in the private market to adequately meet the housing that we need in our community. So we adopt these plans and the regulatory systems to provide opportunities for housing, and we also have to make sure that we're not unduly constraining housing. And I'll talk a little bit about constraints in the housing market as we plan for accommodating these 8,000 units. So continuing on with the purpose, the housing element identifies our needs and establishes goals, policies, and programs, and you'll hear us talk about that quite a bit, to further our commitment to the production of affordable housing and sound community planning. The primary objectives of a housing element are to accommodate not only our projected housing demand, which is the RHNA, so that's sort of the mechanical exercise we need to go through to show that we have the capacity to provide the housing, but really when it comes down to the policies and programs, that's what facilitates the housing production and sets the course for the units to actually be put on the ground. And we need to account for all income levels and household types. We also focus many of our policies on preserving existing housing and especially affordable housing. If we already have housing in the community, what are methods or ways to try to preserve that in a variety of ways, in improving the quality of our existing housing and making sure that we're providing safe and fair access for all to have housing. So how do we go about doing this? So the components of a housing element are largely dictated by the state, and in order to plan for more housing, we go through a series of steps. So first, we analyze a lot of data, census data, demographic data, the condition of our existing housing stock in order to determine what type of housing we need and where those gaps are, where we're not meeting currently the housing demand. Then we look at our existing housing element and evaluate the performance of that. So based on the goals, policies, and programs of that element, what did it produce over the last 7 years in our case? And then we have to consider how we might need to make changes to those policies or programs to create the housing we need. Then we do a constraints analysis, both governmental and non-governmental constraints to housing production. So that might be our zoning capacity or our development standards or permitting process, and then also looking at land and construction costs and how that might be constraining housing. Then we really get into the policy and program development at that point, because we have an understanding, a more detailed understanding of the type of housing we need. We have an understanding perhaps of why it hadn't been produced as significantly in the past, and then we need to look at our policies and programs going forward over the next 8 years to accommodate the housing for our community. All along the way, we're preparing an inventory of vacant or underutilized land. This is called suitable sites inventory. So as was shown in the video, we'll be looking at underdeveloped property, vacant property, any opportunity where we think we can accommodate more housing. And then allocate a certain density assumption for those units and see if we can show that we have the capacity to build 8,000 units. As part of that, we do take into consideration constraints on the site. So whether there's creek setback or steep slopes or historic resources, we will either not count those sites or we'll ratchet down the density assumption for those sites too, so that we're being realistic about potential build out. So this goes into a little bit more detail about what I just explained, planning for the 8,000 units. We also need to assign income categories for the suitable sites. That's a new requirement in this round of the housing element update, whereas before we just needed to show that we could accommodate the overall RHNA. Now we need to assume income categories too and ensure that we can satisfy all the different income levels of our housing demand. And then if we find through that exercise that we don't think we have the capacity to accommodate 8,000 new units, then we may need to rezone some areas. Another new requirement in this year's cycle is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And really the objective here is based on past practices, zoning practices, land transfer practices. If we show, if our data indicates that we have particular areas that are either racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty or of affluence, then we might need to adjust our policies and programs to try to specifically counteract those past practices that may have segregated our community or concentrated whether impoverished or affluent members in certain areas of the community, and try to ensure that everybody has fair and safe access to housing. And then cover real briefly the housing element update timeline. So here we are in April of 2022 establishing our goals at the end of today if we're successful. And then we'll use those goals to guide the policy and program development over the next few months. We'll continue to do our data gathering and suitable sites inventory through June. Be working closely with the planning commissioners who will help us draft the policies and programs, with the objective of releasing the public review draft of the housing element in July. It will be available for 30 days for public review, and during that period, we will have a hearing with the Planning Commission to also receive comment at that hearing and from planning commissioners. At that point, we'll make any revisions to the document based on the comments received, and then submit that draft to the state HCD in August. The state has 90 days to review the document and provide us with any comments at that point. So hopefully they won't take all 90 days, but if they do, we will very quickly make any edits we need to that draft document, and then release a revised draft for public review and hearings with the Planning Commission and City Council, hopefully in January, February, with the final deadline to submit to the state February 15th, 2023. The video touched on this a little bit, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but there are consequences for noncompliance. We've had a compliant and certified housing element since the beginning of preparing housing elements. It allows us to apply for a lot of state grants. It saves us from having more local control taken from us in terms of permitting. And the bottom line is we'd like to have a compliant and certified housing element, so that's our goal. We're going to work as hard as we can to get that accomplished. So stepping back into our current RHNA cycle, the 5th cycle that started in 2015 and ends more or less the end of this year, I want to just touch on the housing that we have produced. Our RHNA allocation in this cycle was 4,100 units. Over this time period, as of December of 2021, we had permitted, so this is units that actually have a building permit, so very likely to be constructed, just under 1,600 units, but still far off the mark of actually producing the 4,100 that our community needed. And then by income level, this is showing just each year the number of permitted units over that same period of time, and by income level. And because we report to the state on an annual basis the number of housing units that received a building permit, I do think it's important to keep in mind we have a pretty significant number of housing units that are pending or approved. So they don't yet have their building permit, but they are in the pipeline to some extent. And the approved ones are the ones shown here in red. Those have some type of discretionary entitlement. It might be Planning Commission, it might be design review, but they have their planning approval at that point, and they could be in the building permit process, but just don't have the permits in hand. The pending ones run the entire gamut of maybe they just applied last week to, they're working their way through to getting approvals. So this is broken down by accessory dwelling units at the top, and then multi-family units by low income, moderate income, and market rate. And as you can see, the significant number of units that we're seeing are market rate or above moderate as it's reported to the state. This shows housing production over a longer period of time. This again is housing units that received building permits in each of these years. And I thought it's interesting to show really just from 2007 to 2021 how volatile, I guess, the housing unit production can be. We see little clusters of low and very low income projects over the years, much thanks to the Housing Authority and People's Self-Help Housing for those. But what's interesting here is a couple of milestones. When the average unit size density incentive program was adopted in 2013, we see a large spike in the above moderate units from that, and then that starts to taper off a little bit until our accessory dwelling unit laws became effective in 2017. And then we see those market rate units again, pretty significant. So do ADUs count towards our RHNA? Yes, they do. They are housing units. Because we don't have deed restrictions on them, they can be rented for any amount, just like any other market rate unit. So they go into the above moderate category at this point for our reports to the state. We did just launch a survey that we've released to all accessory dwelling unit owners, hoping to get some information about how these units are being used. They can answer anonymously if they want to, but we just wanted to get a better understanding of, are these actually being used as units? Are they maybe just continuing to be a home office or maybe for visitors to come? Are they being used, permanent long-term housing? And we're also asking for the rental rate, and if they'll share that with us, that will be good information for us to know, because perhaps some of them might be below market. And that will help our assumptions going forward about where we might be able to put ADUs in which income category going forward. So in terms of public outreach throughout this process, we're using a variety of methods. We have the dedicated website. We're announcing it as often and as broadly as possible. We do intend to release as much information as we can in both English and Spanish. We've also, long-range planning staff has been busy making presentations at a lot of advisory groups and stakeholder boards and commissions, trying to get people involved. And here's just a few of those. So next steps, again, if we are able to adopt housing element goals today, that will help us move us along. We'll continue to gather and analyze the data we need to get a better idea of our overall housing needs in the community. Be working closely with the planning commissioners to draft the policies and programs, and then review and refine the draft housing element over the summer months. So before we jump into looking at our proposed goals, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship of goals, policies, and programs. And I think you'll keep hearing those terms over the next several months. So just to make sure we all understand the distinction there. So goals are very high level. They're aspirational, usually pretty general in nature, not very detailed, because what comes out of the goals are our policies. That sets the regulatory framework to achieve our goals. It's also the standard for project review. So as you know, most discretionary projects in the city need to be found consistent with the general plan, and we look at the general plan policies. So when we have projects in the city, we'll look at the housing element policies. How is this project consistent with the housing element policies? But policies also establish programs, which I think you'll hear from a lot of people in the public talking about the programs. How can we ensure that housing's built? How can we ensure the right type of housing is built? That's really a program level discussion. So those are the implementation measures. And new in this cycle of housing element updates is we need to have those programs with specific timeframes, roles, and measurable outcomes where possible. And this talks a little bit more about that. So when we're talking about how we're going to actually create this housing, we're talking about the programs. We need to identify who's responsible, what is the city's role in implementing that program. And because of this, it really commits the city's resources to housing element implementation over the next 8 years. And that's different than in the past. We had a lot of policies and programs that said, consider this or study that, or, it was more loose terms, and you could sort of pick and choose depending on when you had time to, or the resources to implement the programs. But now we're committing to timelines with this. So we need to make sure that we have the resources in place to carry out the programs that we establish in our housing element. So here's just an example of one to give you an idea of how the hierarchy works. So the goal might be prioritize deed-restricted housing affordable to the workforce and vulnerable communities. So it's very high level, general, it's aspirational. The policy might say, production of affordable housing shall be the highest priority. The city shall encourage new units affordable to extremely low, very low, moderate, and middle income renters and owners. The program might say, amend the zoning ordinance to allow higher densities for projects that provide a greater percentage of affordable housing than otherwise required. So that gives you a sense of that. So getting into our draft 2023 goals, they were in the council agenda report. I've also put on the table for you, and there's extra copies over on the side if anyone else wants to see a comparison of our existing housing element goals and our proposed goals for the next 8 years. I won't get into them right now. I know that we'll spend a pretty healthy time discussing them after public comment, but we do have 7 proposed goals for the next housing element. And when we do turn the conversation back to the commission and the council for questions and deliberation, we'd like to have you consider the goals that staff drafted Let us know if they seem acceptable. Do you have revisions or additions? Is there something we're missing? Is there a policy or program you have in mind and you're not sure it fits in one of the existing goals? Let's talk about that, see if we need to expand the goals. And then that will conclude my presentation with our ending recommendation that the Planning Commission provide input to the City Council, with the City Council ultimately adopting housing element goals for next year. And before I close out entirely, I know Rob Fredericks will be presenting a few slides to you as our affordable housing developer arm of the city. But I did want to acknowledge Dan Gullett and Rosie Deisty here, who really are leading this effort, the project managers for the housing element update. And should you have questions, I think any one of us are happy to answer. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fredericks.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor Rouse, Chair Escobedo, council members, and planning commissioners. It's good to see all of you in person. It's been a long time. I won't take too much time, but I did want to go through a few slides that are being pulled up now. And you've received my written comments, and it'll cover, what I'm going to cover today will be, we'll be covering most of that and of what I put in the comments. And it's more of a program that we think is really important because as the city's affordable housing provider, we as the Housing Authority have a unique perspective and firsthand experience of the affordable housing crisis that our community is facing and that's impacting Santa Barbara. And we agree, sorry, I'll take off my mask for this. We agree with all of the proposed goals that were in the staff report. We think those are important, but we've also taken inventory of what we've been able to produce and past and present, and we've reached the conclusion that what is really essential is a dedicated local funding source for affordable housing if we're going to have any positive impact on meeting our goals of needed affordable housing. If you can go to the second slide, that's the last slide there. If we can go to the, yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Okay, so just to review what we've produced in our history, we now develop and operate 1,411 apartments serving Santa Barbara's workforce seniors and special needs residents. And we operate at 100% occupancy level, meaning we can only provide housing when a unit is vacated. And last year alone, as you'll see on the screen, we had over 1,700 applicants for affordable housing, and we were able to house 94 as a result of vacancies. There's just a tremendous need out there. We have nearly 4,000 households on our waiting list, comprised of seniors, families, low-income workers, and the wait is typically 4 to 6 years. That's the average waiting time. And when people come to our door, they need assistance now, not 4 to 6 years, and it's really tough for our agency. Next slide, please. This slide represents what we were able to produce in the last 10 years or so of the RDA. And in partnerships with the Redevelopment Agency, the Housing Authority created and preserved 418 units of affordable housing in Santa Barbara. And the average city investment through the RDA was just over nearly $48,000 per unit. Post-RDA, in the last 10 years, we've created 228 units, and the average city investment through the community development dollars that they have available was dropped to about $34,000 per unit. So we had, in looking at per units, we had a 55% decrease from what we produced in the last 10 years of the RDA to what we produced currently in the previous 10 years. Next slide. I don't need to belabor this slide much. It's been gone over time and time again, but these are the RENA numbers. The blue section is the current planning period, and what we anticipate the RENA cycle ending is at about 44%. We're really failing in the low, very low, and moderate income. Above moderate is really succeeding, done really well. And if we don't change anything on funding, and we're looking at the current, using that current rate in the next funding cycle, and we're looking at only achieving the next housing element cycle. We're only looking at achieving 22.7% of the allocation. So those are pretty dire numbers. Next slide. So what I mentioned is that we're looking for a local funding source to be made available for affordable housing. Next slide. And we've been looking at the transient occupancy tax, and as Santa Barbara has emerged from the pandemic, there has been a roaring comeback of TOT revenue that is surpassing what was collected prior to COVID-19, and I'll show you that on the next slide. It's been brought up, well, economics could change again and the TOT could lower. We're looking at maybe working with the city and setting a baseline of maybe this year's budget, and anything above that in future years, the allocation can be partially made to affordable housing. If not, we don't make it. So this is a way that I'm going to present that we don't have to increase the TOT tax. Now, it is a hit on general fund, but that's something for you decision makers to decide. Also, I just recently read a report that there are 10 hotels in the pipeline in the city of Santa Barbara of various sizes, providing 500 additional units. That will increase the TOT. Let's go to the next slide. So here's the example of the incremental use of increase in the TOT revenue. You can see the 2019 TOT revenue, that's pre-pandemic, was $23,421,000, and then you take the amount out for creeks and clean water. What went into general fund was $19,517,959. Now let's look at the column for the 2022 year to date, and this was using, I believe, the February numbers. It might be, so it's even come in since, and we have achieved $18,131,000, and going into general fund, it'll be $15 million if we just look at year to date. But projected at the end, at the current revenue stream, you're looking at having TOT revenue come in at $31 million, and after you take out for creeks, that would be $25,901,000, nearly $26 million. So if you took the same amount that's going to creeks off the increase to affordable housing, another $5 million could go to an affordable housing fund. And based on that, we can leverage $5 million 10 to 1. We can leverage that with tax credits and other grant funding sources, and have $50 million to work with to bring in projects. And we're looking at potential of 147 units per year if we had that kind of funding source, or over the life of the next RENA cycle, 1,176 units of affordable housing. So, sorry I took a little bit of time on this, but I think it's really important to look at why we're looking at the TOT. As I put in our memo, there's a perfect nexus to low-income workers at in the hospitality industry and visitors coming to restaurants and waiters, and they all need affordable housing. So I think there's a very good tie-in to make that nexus for taking some additional TOT money into the Affordable Housing Fund that could be created as a program. Now, I've been talking with Ms. Bjork and others, and we want to work together if the council sees this as a good transition and look at it as beginning perhaps in the next 2-year budget cycle. So there's plenty of time to plan and budget other items out in the general fund. So let's go to my second to last slide, so you know I'm not going to take up too much more time. Housing element goal suggestions. Let's go to the next one here. So again, low-income developments, very much needed affordable housings across the board. Seniors, disabled individuals, families, low-income workforce. We need more permanent supportive housing to serve the homeless. And we need funding for supportive services as well. And we've been giving a lot of thought to the city putting out a lot of dollars for services dedicated to homelessness in the last year. Perhaps 20% of that housing, affordable housing fund off the TOT could be set aside to support services. That would alleviate some of the general fund that's already going out for the services. And there's a great need for moderate to middle income housing. We're very excited about 400 West Carrillo, the Carrillo Castillo commuter lot. We went to historic landmarks recently, got some great comments. We're going back again after making some changes, and after that, we're moving full speed ahead on that, and we want to get that development done as a test project that we can replicate elsewhere. Other funding opportunity strategies that I've read about that we agree with, perhaps a vacancy tax on second homes, bonding against the city's housing loans that are coming in, the revenue that's coming in. That could be something. Fee waivers and fee deferrals. I would love to be able to have a program with the city on the accessory dwelling units where we could make some of them deed restricted if the owners take incentives from the city. Perhaps there's an incentive program for fee waivers or whatnot, and then they agree to take voucher holders into their ADUs for a period of time. And that would get us more low-income affordable housing. Also, have the idea of, this may be too far down in the weeds, but purchasing existing units that we do all the time. Also capitalized buy down of rents to increase the number of moderate income units. So, you know, a private developer, they're currently required to do 10% under inclusionary. Well, what if we work with that developer and through this affordable housing fund and say, we want another 10% of moderate income housing. We'll take some of that affordable housing fund and give it to them up front, but then that extra 10% is also deed restricted for 90 years for moderate to middle income. So that's something to talk about. And really, you've heard it time and time again as well. Time is money. We need to expedite design review and permit processing, not only for affordable housing, but moderate and middle income. And I do think we need to look at opportunities like La Cumbre Mall and city-owned properties as we move forward in the housing element and putting that down. And I'll just close by saying, next slide while that's up. I'll just close by saying we are really grateful that we're working closely with the city on the housing element. We're excited about it. And we do think that this transient occupancy tax funding source is very important. It's something that possibly can be done with your support. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fredericks. Per the agenda, we're going to go ahead and go to public comment. And that'll be 3 minutes on the subject we're talking about today. And if we have the timer, Madam Clerk, there we go. And the official timer is Mr. Gutierrez. I have Matt Taylor. And the timer is up there on the wall in case you're wondering where you're at, so. Okay, very good.
Thank you. All on behalf of the family that owns a good portion of the La Cumbre Mall, the land underneath it, we deeply appreciate all that you do to make Santa Barbara a great place to live. So just want to personally thank you for that. You know, my brother is, I just got wind that he's coming down next week. He's going to move back from Monterey, so I'm really excited about that. He's a good friend of mine, and but he can't crash on my couch forever. Right? We need to we need to do what we can to give him a place to live too. So anyway, thanks for being here, and we're super excited about working with you all. And I'll pass it to Matt from here.
Yeah. So good morning, Council and Planning Commission. Matthew Taylor, Santa Barbara native, grew up here, local developer. Just our quick blurb: we represent the ownership groups that own the La Cumbre Plaza property. In our review of the existing general plan and zoning ordinance, we understand the city has a designated La Cumbre Plaza to be developed with its highest priority unit designation per acre. We would ask that the cities use this housing element update to, consider the existing policies that affect that area and the guidelines and regulations that affect La Cumbre Plaza, and analyze how they may affect the city's ability to achieve that actual housing density. So if there are inconsistencies, unintended obstacles in the city's policies and guidelines that would prevent the city from achieving the density at La Cumbre Plaza, I think they should be addressed in the housing element. This is an opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, are there any more speaker slips? And then if not, are there speakers waiting online?
Mr. Mayor, no further speaker slips unless anyone, nope. And there are a number of people who are ready to speak online.
Okay, 3 minutes on each speaker, please. First speaker.
Very good. I'll call out the names of the few first speakers. We'll have Linda Honickman, then Cassandra Ensberg, Anna Marie Gott, and Zach Schlegel. Linda Honickman, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Linda Honickman, Chair of the Housing Committee for the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara. Over the last 2 years, our league has updated our own housing positions, which includes supporting efforts to preserve and significantly increase low and moderate income housing supply for all ages, family sizes, and disabilities, and prioritizing local residents and workers for the new units. In our letter sent to you yesterday, we offered additional wording for 5 of the goals in bold for your consideration. I will read the revised wording followed by our reasons. Goal 1, create new, healthy, safe, and energy efficient housing that meets community needs and allows for diversity. This acknowledges the need for diversity, which the League believes is important. Goal 2, prioritize deed-restricted housing that is affordable to the city's workforce of low to moderate incomes and vulnerable communities over other types of development. Reason, there have been different definitions of workforce used by the city and county, many using the above moderate income level, which is the same as market rate as far as RHNA is concerned. Goal 4, promote housing stability, retain existing affordable housing, produce units for very low to moderate incomes in line with RHNA targets, identify a consistent funding source, and discourage tenant displacement. Reason, there will be no housing stability without a significant increase in production of affordable units, and that will require substantial reliable funding, which we just heard about. Goal 6, educate the community about housing issues confronting different generations affordable housing opportunities, and available resources and programs. Reason: homeowners and older residents may not understand how the ability to afford housing has changed for younger generations and renters in recent years. Goal 7, coordinate with regional partners. Coordinate with surrounding communities to address regional housing needs of homelessness and a jobs housing balance, and identify and seek new funding sources. Reason: finding new state and federal grants will also be important for a regional effort. Overall, we believe that the proposed goals are a big improvement over the previous goals where affordable housing was not prioritized. We also strongly recommend that you have a robust plan for hearing and responding to the voices of renters, since they are the most impacted by our local housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Cassandra Ensberg. Cassandra Ensberg, please go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good morning, Mayor, Council, Planning Commission, and City staff. I am here, Cassandra Ensberg, architect and co-chair of the AIASB Advocacy Committee, and I'm here to speak on behalf of AIASB. We wish to thank you all for this important collaborative meeting today. We give special thanks to our long-range planning staff for that great presentation and video, as we search for the best methods to achieve and regulate housing that will be sensitive to and in keeping with our unique Santa Barbara style and personality. And we also want to thank Mr. Fredericks for the report and the work of our housing authority, and of course, always to the community at large. We hope you all received the AIASB letter that we sent earlier this week, and I wanted to just briefly highlight what we believe to be is the best approach to this issue. AIASB suggests consideration of implementation of the following. Since the size, bulk, and scale and design aesthetic is already well regulated by our objective design standards, we suggest that flexibility be given to the developer to determine the number of units within the structure. We believe that this will simplify the process and help us make progress on our housing goals of more moderate and low income level units. Also, to allow buildings to exceed 48 feet, given the inclusion of a higher percentage of moderate, middle, lower income level units. We also suggest, as Mr. Fredericks mentioned, a tax-deductible fund or foundation to help subsidize more moderate income and lower level units in the private sector developments, and also to assist the funding for the housing authority. Finally, we can achieve better understanding of the challenges and solutions through continued collaborative work with the community, with the development community, of course, the housing authority, and those working in the private sector. Thank you again for this important work today and for finding effective ways to move forward in facilitating and realizing our housing needs. Thank you.
Thank you. May we have the next speaker, please?
Next speaker is Anna Marie Gott. Anna Marie Gott, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor, council members, and commissioners. First, I do agree with Rob Fredericks that we need a funding force for affordable housing. I just don't agree on how we get there. Instead of waiting to reallocate money over the course of 2 years regarding the TOT and not increasing it, I say we just increase it now to 15%. Next year, that would bring in, based on the current projection, $7.8 million that could be used for funding. Regarding the TOT, I think that we also need to eliminate any ability for someone to not pay the TOT tax through an exemption, except in the case of a disaster that is recognized by the city of Santa Barbara. We should also look at imposing commercial development impact fees passing a parcel tax that could be used for housing, as well as childcare, which is one of the biggest expenses that our younger employees with families have. We should also look at passing a mitigation fee for vacant and second homes, and that would be annual instead of a one-time fee. That might be able to bring back some homes into the housing market. But I think the biggest thing that you need to look at is wages. We need an actual living wage ordinance, and instead of having the city go after multiple task force and a dozen years of probably debating it, I think this just needs to be put on the ballot this year. We also need to look at a moratorium on accepting and processing and issuing building permits for any new hotel rooms. We have over 500 in the pipeline now, and we are looking at areas of the city where we want housing, but instead of housing, we're getting more hotels, and the hotels obviously generate the need for lower income housing, and we need to take a step back with so many units in the pipeline. We should also look at an overlay for hotels instead of allowing them everywhere in the city where there is a commercial property. We should really look at placing a number in each area of the city and having that as a maximum, and only allowing hotels in very specific areas of our commercial districts. We have a number of larger, older apartment buildings that were developed with HUD financing. All of those apartment buildings should be in an affordable housing overlay.
You need to wrap up,
And
please.
that should happen, immediately. I have some other things that I put down on my list, but one of the things that I forgot was the ADU and JADUs. Those are
good. Thank
currently
you.
allowed in some areas to be short-term vacation rentals, and that should be prohibited. Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Our next speaker is Josh Schlegel, then John Campanella, Nadia Abushanab, Frank Rodriguez, and Lucia Trujillo. Zach Schlegel, please go ahead.
Good morning, Mayor Rouse, council members, and commissioners. My name is Zach Schlegel. I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy at PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our feedback on the city's proposed housing element goals today. The draft goals accurately convey the necessity of building new housing to address homelessness. The prioritization of affordable housing in goal number 2 is critically important, but we would ask that you broaden goal number 1 to be more inclusive of housing of all types. As a longtime homeless service provider and housing developer, we know that the solution to homelessness is housing. Yet, we also know that one size does not fit all. The city and the region need to develop more housing of all types for all income brackets. We would also suggest broadening goal number 4 to include prevention services to help bottleneck the inflow of people entering into the homeless system. Ideally, this would include long-term supportive services, which is a critical component of successful permanent supportive housing strategy. Additionally, we would ask that you broaden goal number 7 to include other stakeholders, including homeless service providers like PATH, nonprofit organizations, business groups, housing developers, and community advocates, with an emphasis on those with lived experience. Lastly, we welcome the conversation around the concept of a local funding stream for affordable housing, and we would encourage this and would like to be an active partner in the conversation. We thank you again for your continued dedication to solving the housing crisis that has vexed the city, the region, and the state. PATH stands ready to be a partner in meeting and exceeding the goals you've put forth today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is John Campanella. John Campanella, please go ahead. John Campanella, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Good morning. I'd like to suggest under housing element goals that are being evaluated to include some aspects of what the FAR was trying to accomplish, and that is to create a more predictable outcome, encourage the construction of housing, but also allow more units being proposed within each building. It was made clear at the time that we couldn't accomplish this with the current density units per acre as a current controlling factor. The current density was created 10 years ago and has now become a constraint, actually, to development since site and construction costs have increased dramatically. It's difficult to achieve housing goals when the density allows a maximum of units that might be half or 50% of what could be created by complying with the other development requirements for multi-unit housing. Building height, setbacks, open yard, and parking are all well defined by zone. By operating within these development requirements, more housing can be created through flexibility in designing and dividing livable square footage per floor. Housing can also be placed on more floors than allowed under AUD density and still not exceed the maximum building height. The maximum allowed AUD density and average unit sizes result in limitations. Medium-high effectively, when you calculate it out, can only afford to build about one floor of residences. Medium-high projects have been successful in multifamily zones where you utilize surface parking, but no projects have been developed in Upper State Street, commercial zones where only medium-high density is allowed. In the commercial zones, you'd also be required to provide parking structures, which makes development prohibited at this level of density. High density would allow about 1.5 floors of residences, priority effectively 2, if you look at the Anatega building down the block from City Hall. Based on these density limits, they're impacted by the fact that half or more of the construction required at these densities is for podium, circulation, stairs, elevators, and not for the residences themselves. This inefficient relationship is significantly affected by cost increases. In order to facilitate multi-unit housing, consider removing the current density limits and allow projects the flexibility to design a site under the other development requirements. Also, include the intent of FAR above relative to having predictable outcomes and also allowing more units to be built within buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. Prior to the next speaker, I'll announce that you'll need to raise your hand if you wish to speak online by 10:10, and that's the last time we'll take online speakers to join in. May we have the next speaker, please?
Yes, our next speaker, one moment here. Our next speaker is Nadia Abushanab, then Frank Rodriguez, Lucia Trujillo, and then Ken Trujillo. Nadia Abushanab, please go ahead.
Good morning, Mayor Rouse, Commissioner Escobedo, and City Council members and Planning Commissioners. Thank you, first of all, for hosting this meeting, and thank you to the staff for their great presentation. I'm here on behalf of Santa Barbara County Action Network, SBCAN, and myself as a renter on the west side. And first of all, we think that these goals are, they're great goals. I think they represent really a broad picture of what's needed in the community. And I'm very interested to see where it goes with the policies and the programs. And I think that's going to be the real challenging part. So I just have a couple comments on the first goal of creating new, healthy, safe, and energy efficient housing that meets the community needs. So I think that, yes, we do need more housing, and the city has actually been pretty successful in meeting this goal already for the above moderate income units. So the policies you've already put in place regarding density increases have already met and will likely exceed this goal. So I think it's really important to, bump up that second goal to prioritize the affordable housing. And that's what will really meet the community needs. We certainly support Mr. Frederick's ideas, and we agree that there is the need for a dedicated local funding source to increase that affordable housing stock. And I'm really excited to see what can be done with the TOT tax and potentially a vacancy tax on second homes. I think there's a lot of potential to restrict short-term rentals and enforcement there to help increase the vacancy rate for renters as well. And lastly, as a member of the Santa Barbara Tenants Union, I just also wanted to say that there is no goal that I can see that is specifically about renter protections, protecting tenants. I think there's a lot of things that can be done, such as right to counsel in eviction cases, right to first refusal when a home goes for sale, improved education of tenants' rights to organize. And all of these, I think, can be encompassed in the goal of limiting displacement. So I just wanted to put those out there, and I'm very excited to see where this goes. And I hope that you continue to outreach to the community and especially prioritize outreaching to renters and tenants. As others have said, they will be the most impacted by these housing decisions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. May we have the next speaker, please?
Next speaker is Frank Rodriguez. Frank Rodriguez, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Mayor Rouse, Council, and Planning Commissioners. Frank Rodriguez here with CAUSE, the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. Really wanted to echo what Nadia just spoke on, all those points. As CAUSE, as a lot of y'all know, we really try to focus on development without displacement. And hence we have had a large focus on tenant protections to make sure that any type of new development that comes, especially for our areas like in the east side and west side, doesn't act as a gentrification tool that pushes out communities who can't keep up with rents. So I think there's a lot of great ideas that I've been talking about. Some we also want to elevate is just an affordable housing overlay zoning, and really thinking about how do we make sure we protect areas and do kind of those first right of refusals, especially for our housing authority to be the ones kind of developing kind of older or newer structures that come on in the east side and west side. But overall, I think for us, we want to see how we make sure tenants are protected through tenant protections, and that we get the type of real affordable housing for, as Rob Fredericks was mentioning, for our hospitality industry, for our service industry, for folks that really depend on that workforce housing, but also really elevate when folks are talking about capital A affordable housing. How do we make sure that is part of our equation? And we know that a funding source is the most important part to reach that goal. So we're fully committed to continuing those conversations of how do we find that funding source. Thank you, Nadia, for raising the vacancy tax and other sources that we can look into, but really how us as a community can step up and push that, because we know we need development. We know this is a long-term plan, and we know the housing element is a big piece of this equation. So we want to make sure that the input of renters and community members are received, but also we look at how do we really get that capital A affordable for low-income folks that make up a huge workforce here in Santa Barbara. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Lucia Trujillo, Ken Trujillo, Chelsea Lancaster, and Stanley Zankoff. Lucia Trujillo, please go ahead.
Good morning, Mayor, council members, Planning Commission, and city staff. Thank you for your time and presentations. These proposed goals are much better than in the past. I just have a few comments. So looking at goal number 1, I echo what others have said to incorporate diversity and inclusion. That is very important for our city and state. Goal number 2, define workforce, and under affordable include moderate to middle income members, and ensure units are actually built during this next cycle. So, and for goal number 4 and 5, it is critical because city workforce will not need to relocate to neighboring cities, and it increases their quality of life, and it also, I'm trying to read my comments here. It increases our quality of life and our community. It makes our community better. Specifically, prevent short-term rentals, the conversion of short-term rentals, and or restrict the conversion into short-term rentals, because I know that's been a big problem, and code enforcement has had a hard time enforcing those and penalize them. I also want to echo what Frederickson said from the Housing Authority, is that we need a funding source, and the funding source coming from the short-term rentals and the vacancy tax would be ideal in our situation here, since we are a community where there is a lot of tourism. And I am also looking forward to see the policies that come out of these goals, and how they're actually created. And it's really important that we, being that 60% of the community are renters, it's important that we get input from our renters. So, town hall meetings would be a great idea when creating maybe these policies or whatnot. Okay, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you. May we have the next speaker, please?
Our next speaker is Trin Cantrahirio. Please go ahead. Ken, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and go ahead, Ken. There you go. You are unmuted, so you can go ahead and speak. Okay. We will come back to Ken. Chelsea Lancaster. Chelsea Lancaster, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, good morning. Feels like afternoon today. Just wanted to call in and support and really amplify and uplift the comments that have been made by both Nadia and Frank. Really want to kind of amplify the need to include renters' voices and the people that are most disproportionately impacted by the decisions and choices that are made by the city. I feel like that's been a really critical missing piece. And of course, folks have shown up to really use their voice and tell their personal stories, but that needs to be an invitation, an intentional invitation, and to really see the value, again, in the opinions and solutions. Frankly, people need to be engaged in the solutions for the problems that they face. That's how we build truly healthy communities. Really want to amplify the capital A in affordable as a primary, a priority here, to really name that if we don't participate in the right kind of development, we know that the end result is always going to be displacement. So we have to have meaningful tenant protections. And again, I watched the presentation from the hospitality industry, and I think, if we're having conversations about workforce issues and not having a complete conversation about why that is the case, that people, again, literally cannot live here, people that want to live here, generations of folks that are being displaced. Also really want to amplify and support the vacancy tax. Again, I know that we are, Santa Barbara, all communities are unique in terms of their needs, but really looking at something that just happened in Atlanta when we're thinking about vacation rentals. So really looking forward to changing the conversation, including more voices, again, those that are disproportionately impacted. I also want to name that I'm calling in as a homeowner in affordable housing in the El Zoco development. And this is the only way that I, as a community member, have been able to stay here. I was a renter as a single mother for decades and was displaced. I had to move a total of 12 times with my daughter. and that was a really jarring and as a person who had privilege in a lot of different ways, but in terms of especially having a stable job and my credit and racial privilege and all that good stuff. So just wanted to name that I'm calling in as somebody who has benefited from programs in the city and would love to also see more of that developed as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. May we have the next speaker, please?
Next speaker is Stanley Zankov. Stanley Zankov, please go ahead.
Hello, and thanks everybody here today for your time and insight and for your care with this really big issue and what's really a big, important opportunity. I'm calling in today as a working class renter, working here in the nonprofit sector, and as a co-founder of the Santa Barbara Tenants Union. And today I just want to primarily echo the expertise brought forward by Frank Rodriguez with CAUSE, as well as Nadia Bushnab with SB Can and the Santa Barbara Tenants Union, and as well as Linda Honigman with the League of Women Voters. I also just really appreciating the previous commenter, Chelsea Lancaster's approach to really centering the voices and uplifting those most disproportionately impacted by these issues. I also just want to speak up and just echo and add here that I think meaningful tenant protections should be really considered as part of this. As we talk about bold housing construction, that is pinned to income levels. I'm really relieved that that's now a requirement. And construction that's not going to contribute to displacement, but push back on that. I also see this as a process that could and should consider some of the widespread systemic problems with housing affordability that we at the Tenants Union are seeing quite often. Lucia Trujillo brought up some of these. Want to echo her as well. Things like renovation evictions or rent evictions, bad faith just cause evictions, short-term rental conversions that significantly displace long-term renters, as well as cracking down on illegal rent increases, are all part of the housing availability dynamics that I hope will be included in the study. I also would ask y'all to consider how we get that really important seed money for the Housing Authority sooner than 2 years. And just want to say thank you to the city staff who have been, I've seen doing their best to popularize this really wonky process, including here today. And that the Tenants Union and others who have spoken here today are really interested in being active partners in really uplifting the voices of those that are most left out of these really important, but oftentimes sort of anemic conversations, right, that oftentimes really don't include those voices. So thanks to Chair Escobedo and others on the Planning Commission, those on the council have demonstrated a thoughtful and grounded approach to housing in our city. As cliche as it sounds, it's no less true. We need y'all now more than ever. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
We have Ken Trujillo. I'll unmute you for a moment, and if you'd like to speak, please unmute and go ahead. Very good. No further speakers, Mr. Mayor.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. So we're going to go to council and commission questions. What I'm going to ask is this, that we go through a kind of a brief, I'll call on everybody as we sit up here, including I see Commissioner Bonderson up there as well. I'd like to keep this really brief because we still have to get to, the Planning Commission is going to have input for us on all these things, and then there's going to be deliberations and finally, hopefully approving the housing element goals. So I'm going to ask each of you in line to ask questions if you do have them. If you don't at this time, please pass. But please be really, really brief, and I'm going to ask the same of staff in response. So Commissioner Lodge, I'll start with you. Do you have a question?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I do. there's been discussion of possibly a moratorium on accepting new applications for more hotel rooms. And they are, ABR, HLC, they are coming forward. And worst of all is that a great project that was an AUD project at 710 State Street with, I think, 34 rental units is now looking at, instead of that, 66 hotel rooms, the last thing we need. And, which generating more low-wage jobs and an even greater need for affordable housing. Is there any way that the city can stop this? I guess that would.
Mayor Rouse and Commissioner Lodge, I'll let our attorney speak to any type of moratorium, but I will let you know that we are equally disappointed in seeing what we thought would be some housing projects going through in some critical areas of our community, and then being later withdrawn and then proposed as hotels. And when we've talked to a couple of those developers, they've told us it just is financially more feasible for them. So I think if we wanted to put into the housing element some policies or programs that disincentivize hotels and further encourage housing, that would be one way we could try to do it. We wouldn't be able to solve that today, but that would be something that the housing element could address.
Thank you.
Ms. Ostringer.
Mayor Rouse, Commissioner Lodge, yes, we can do a moratorium. And as Ms. Brooks said, another element or another way to get there is through our housing element, but we could impose a moratorium against additional hotel rooms.
Oh, good news. Okay. And then there have been suggestions about increasing the TOT and sorry, Ms. Ostringer. And I just wanted to confirm this. And imposing a vacancy tax. These, as new taxes, would have to go to the vote of the public, right?
Sorry, we divvied this up between land use and tax. So, yes, the voters could impose a vacancy tax. The constraint you're facing is that absent a unanimous vote from the council declaring a fiscal emergency, you'd need to wait until the next general election, which is in 2024.
Thank you. Okay, those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Wiscombe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have one question. I think it must be slide number 20, Ms. Brooke, pending and approved housing units. I see up there ADUs. Those are pending, and I don't see any approved. Could you explain that? Because I've heard basically some real long delays in approving ADUs, even in existing structures. So.
Great question, Commissioner Wiscombe. Thank you for noticing that. So the reason that there are no approved, no ADU shown in the approved category is the approved really refers to the planning application approval process. And as you know, ADUs are ministerial. So just with the simplicity of this chart, because they just go through the building permit process, they're all shown as pending in the permit review process.
Thank you. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I just have one question, Renee, for you. Not that there'd be such a thing that I know of, but if you don't have a deed restricted AUD, are AUDs all counted as above moderate also?
Councilmember Jordan, and you do mean AUD, average unit size density.
I certainly do.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure.
Yep.
So, correct. If there is not a deed restriction that we can ensure that it's being rented to a certain income or household type, then yes, they're all above moderate.
So back to the future with me and you. A planning commission agonized over post-occupancy AUD surveys, so we would have that kind of information. And so that never really came to fruition, and was kind of in the same boat as not really knowing what's going in to ADU occupancies either, right? We're putting both of those into the same bucket of the RENA category without really knowing what's being charged or who's living there, right?
Councilmember Jordan, we have some survey data from AUD units. We have, after they've been occupied for a year, we send a survey out to the property owner or manager. We are somewhat successful in getting responses. Maybe Mr. Gold or Dicey have more information on that. But that can't change how it was permitted in the past, but it does give us information about the future. What are these actually being rented for, both for AUDs and accessory dwelling units? So we can get a sense of who's living in them and their rental rate.
So I just have one more. Ariel, I'm sorry to get you up again. So if we can talk about, in today's world of rentals, a rent registry, what has prevented us in the past legally from talking about an occupancy registry for selected type rental units, whether they're ADUs or AUDs?
Honorable Mayor, Chair of the Commission, Councilmember Jordan, I don't know what stopped you from talking about it.
We did talk about it. I guess what's the question is what?
It's
I was
lawful.
told that it was
It's
illegal to make it mandatory on an occupancy process with AUDs, that we could not mandate the return of that information.
I don't agree with that.
Okay,
I
fair
think
enough.
with legislative authority in the ordinance, that could be part of an application process.
Good. I'll keep it on my list then. Thanks.
Mr. Gutierrez.
Mr. Colon, if you could just stay up there. You had mentioned that in order to implement something like a vacancy tax, it would have to be put on the ballot for the people to decide. And you said that it wouldn't be possible till 2024. Is there any way we could have it be a ballot measure before that?
Two ways, and I'll drop the formality of addressing the chair and mayor. Two ways. First, the citizens could initiate a measure before then, and with sufficient signatures, compel a special election. The second way is, as I said, a declaration of fiscal emergency. That requires a unanimous vote of the council.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Chair Escobedo.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Brooke, I'm just going to, I have a few questions. So, for adaptive reuse of either commercial or residential properties, is there a goal currently of the 7 that policy or program would fit under?
Great question. Let's see.
And I have a couple
Right,
of
it could be goal 1. Goal 1 is pretty broad, creating new, healthy, safe, energy-efficient housing. I would say it's probably going to fall under create new housing more than any of the other goals.
Okay. So there would be an avenue to have that discussion in the future?
Correct.
Okay. And then how about following up on Commissioner Lodge's question about hotels, disincentivizing hotels in the future? Is there a goal? Would it probably fall under goal 1 as well?
Most likely, just because, again, that is such a broad goal that if creating new housing is one of our overall goals, then what might come from that is, as we have a non-residential growth management program in place, it might just be further ratcheting down on some of those categories, including hotels. And goal 2, right, for affordable housing specifically, right, prioritizing that over all other types of development.
Thank you. And then as it relates to the funding streams that the Housing Authority had talked about developing those local funding streams, is it your suggestion that it would fall under one of the current goals, or would it be beneficial to create an 8th goal that would specify and call out that particular effort if that's the direction City Council wanted to go?
Great question. It could come under goal 2. 7 is also pretty broad. That's coordinating with regional partners. There was another public comment about being also including local community partners. So that could be, I think, the purpose of Goal 7, it's similar to a goal we have in our housing element now, is really trying to get at the jobs, housing imbalance. So again, just trying to make sure that jobs and housing are going in the right places and those things that cross agency boundaries. Prioritizing affordable housing, a policy or program could come from that to identify funding sources for affordable housing, I would say.
Okay. And let's see. On that goal 7, you just triggered a question, is when we partner with regional partners, let's say someone like UCSB, right, to really push them to develop housing, or maybe a neighboring jurisdiction, do we get credit for those units in RENA when it is a partnership, or is it just wherever the development is in terms of jurisdiction?
Right, correct. Commissioner Escobedo, it's typically determined by where the units are developed. In cases where we've had annexations that also create housing, we'll usually negotiate with the county in those situations, and the county and the city will allocate a certain number of those new units to both agencies. But I've not seen it go completely outside of the city's boundaries to count towards our RENA.
Okay. 1 second. Yeah, that's my last question. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Harmon?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much. Yeah, following up on Chair Escobedo, my primary question was about how funding sources would fit into this. And I'll just say, I'm not going to bury the lead. I would really like to see an additional goal identifying the need to develop funding sources. And I guess that gets me to a question. Is there any reason that we wouldn't want to include more goals? Are we trying to be limited here? Are we trying to be, I mean, I understand you could go on forever having 1,000 goals, and so we don't want to do that. But is there something I'm missing in terms of if we include it, we could cause problems down the road? It seems from what I'm hearing from everyone you included, without the funding sources, a lot of this won't be possible. So it seems probably maybe even like goal number 2 should be. So is there a reason that we wouldn't want to include more? Or?
Councilmember Harmon, no, there's no limit on the number of goals. We were already expanding it from 5 to 7. I think just trying to keep them sort of, plain speak and aspirational, so they're brief. But if there's like we said earlier, if there's something that's missing, please let us know, and we'll either add it to the goal or add a new goal if you really want it to stand alone and have the policies and programs come directly from that.
Awesome. Yeah, I would really personally like to see it its own goal. But that's it for comments. I'll get back to my questions. Thank you. Just to clarify, because we had a couple of different questions about TOT and vacancy tax. Mr. Klon, I think this is for you. In terms of Mr. Frederick's suggestion, his initial suggestion not to increase TOT, but to use a portion of the existing percentage of TOT, that doesn't require a vote of the people. We only have to go to the people if we want to increase the percentage of TOT. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So in theory, we could implement that program tomorrow. It's only the increasing the tax that would need to be voted on?
Yes, subject to the general concept that the successor council is not bound by that determination and could change at any time.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's helpful. And then just a quick question, Ms. Brooke, about goal number 2 and
let me add something that's important there. The effect of limiting you to your decision and not binding successor councils means it makes it difficult to use as a funding stream for debt.
Forever, right. Okay. Makes sense. Thank you for that. On goal number 2, where we want to prioritize deed-restricted housing, I certainly understand and in theory agree with that. I've gotten some feedback recently, though, about the challenges of deed-restricted housing for the long term in terms of not being able to keep up housing to the quality that we want. So I guess my question would be, do we want to be this specific in this goal to say deed-restricted, or do we want to maybe broaden it to say something about I don't even know. Ensure that housing is affordable. I don't know. I understand the implication behind it, but I think it's been a real challenge for people over the lifetime of their housing. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Hartman. That's a great point, and I believe the intent here in including deed restricted is because this goal specifically is prioritizing what we call capital A affordable housing so that we can ensure that it's always being occupied by certain households meeting income categories. The general catch-all for creating new housing, market rate and affordable, is goal 1. So unless there's another way to also emphasize that goal 2 is focused strictly on affordable housing that we can ensure remains affordable housing for its life, I don't know of any other mechanism than deed restriction, but maybe there are other programs.
Commissioner Wiscombe, do you have a thought on? Sorry.
Well, Councilmember Harmon, I totally agree with you. I think it's too specific, and I actually I have some wordsmithing things here on some of the goals, but with this one, prioritize housing opportunities for all without discrimination while emphasizing development of affordable housing for very low and moderate income households. And that gets away from that term because there may be other ways to do that than deed restriction.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Sorry, Mr. Mayor. I would support that type of approach. I just, if we're going to be broad and give ourselves the flexibility through this, I would prefer to do that. Just my 2 cents. And then my final question. We heard a lot of public comment today about our city's renters and where tenant protections fit into this. And can you give me your sense of where renter issues fit into these goals? Maybe the answer is everywhere. And maybe there's a specific one. And what is your view, the view of staff, about having a specific goal related to that? Would that be too specific?
Councilmember Harmon, a great question. So I have a goal 4 up here. Retain existing affordable housing and discourage tenant displacement. I might actually, looking at this closer, reverse those just to ensure that we mean all tenants. Discourage tenant displacement and retain existing affordable housing. That and then the preserve housing captures all income levels, but just again, preserving the housing we already have on the ground, whether that's through ways that people can rehabilitate or extend the life of their existing housing, and discourage conversion to other uses too.
Thank you. I totally missed goal 4 somehow. I appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I'd like to remind everybody to try to stay away from going into deliberations right now. Let's get our questions to staff. We're going to go next. We'll be going to Planning Commission's input to us about these plans. So, Ms. Sneddon.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse, and thank you, staff. And I realize, this is our big opportunity in giving, asking questions and input now. So I just want to ask, before we wordsmith the individual goals, just sort of a little bit of background on why some of these have been changed. So just starting with the staff report on page 2 and the slides, there's like emphasis on supporting housing growth and retention across all income levels. And I'm wondering why we've sort of dropped the emphasis on mention of low to moderate income or special needs, especially in light of that our moderate production is about 95% and all the other categories are failing. I'm wondering why the change to emphasize all income levels instead of the emphasis on moderate to low, to very low.
Councilmember Sneddon, as part of this exercise, we were trying to simplify the goals from what we had before. We did have a much wordier goal with housing opportunities. We're not opposed to including the income levels, but we knew we were going to get into those with the policies.
Okay, so that we can leave that open, that we might put that language back in. Okay, thank you. And then also staff report, page 2, and I'm really interested in the environmental resources element update that's going to be concurrent, I suppose, and the safety element. I'll just say I'm not really understanding why those would be later. It seems to me that they should be taken into account when we're planning increased development and where that might be. So particularly with the environmental resources, our landfill that's running out of space, our wastewater impacts, our water impacts, vehicle miles traveled, impacts of affluence. I mean, we know that one affluent unit is a multiplier in terms of waste also. So when does that become part of the consideration?
Council members, then it is part of the consideration with the environmental review. And we did have a hearing last week with Planning Commission. I won't belabor it, but we are looking at the climate action plan with the housing element together to see how those things affect each other.
And at what point in the timeline do those two dovetail? Or is it all the way from beginning
all the way through the environmental review, and the safety element update will follow. That's because of our current staffing situation and the timeline we have to meet for HCD.
Okay,
And,
but your current staffing will keep in mind the safety element as your...
Yes, and we have outlined what we need to do for the safety element, and we do have a staff member who has written safety elements in the past.
Thank you. And I do want to emphasize that this was going to be, what, a $200,000 thing, and then now it's done by staff, so I appreciate. Questions about the timeline. So today we're setting overarching goals. I'm going to say I feel really uncomfortable that we haven't had the full analysis of our last housing element drafts and those steps 1 and 2 in the slides for an analysis of that, and just when will we go deep into evaluating the effectiveness of the 5th cycle elements as we're setting our goals? And could today's goals be for the purposes of environmental review? Because we may find things when we do public outreach, when we go through the process.
Yes, council members, then just the last part first. We will have an opportunity to revisit the project description for environmental review, but we will get started with where we think it will go, but we will have the opportunity to go back to it late summer. Sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Oh, sorry. So that's, I mean, I think that's all part of it, is at what point does council have input again? So on the timeline as it's laid out right now, we have today, and then the next time we see it is a draft form, and I'm a little uncomfortable with that.
Yes, council members, then staff shares that discomfort, and we would encourage participation. We understand there's a new task force that council created that may be an avenue to have additional discussions. We do have 2 planning commissioners that we're going to be working with very closely as we develop policies. So a consideration for council and the planning commission is to have additional meetings to work out policies.
Thank you. So those will be opportunities to look at policies, what policies might address the goals, and look deeper into those.
Correct.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I'm actually really happy to hear that. So we've dropped on page 4 in goal 1, it doesn't matter what page, but on goal 1, we've sort of dropped the language of living within our resources, which has been in the general plan element since 1964. And I'm wondering if that's deliberate or if we can just put that back in.
Council members, then that is part of our city charter. It's also part of our land use element, and all of our general plan needs to be internally consistent, or maybe the housing element changes some things and we change the land use element in a response, but it is part of what we're looking at.
Okay, so we could put that back in.
That's an option.
Without any problem, okay. And then there's a couple places of reference to the buffer relating to RENA numbers. It's 8,001 units plus a buffer. I'm not familiar with the requirement for a buffer, or why are we adding that into ourselves?
This is a newer standard, so this is a recommendation from HCD as jurisdictions develop their suitable sites inventories and figure out where the units will go. As Ms. Brooke indicated, we also have to indicate where affordable units will go. So if we see a development come in that doesn't develop at the maximum potential density on a particular site or doesn't provide the affordability that we're anticipating, then it needs to be balanced out somewhere else. So that's why they're recommending these buffers to provide that additional capacity somewhere else, or we'll always have the opportunity to meet our 8,001 during this period.
Thank you. And is that a percentage or a number, a hard number? How do we define the buffer?
It's a percentage.
Thank you. And then zoning-wise, do we already have the zoning to meet our 6-cycle RENA requirements?
Yes. So there's a few different things in play with housing elements. So there's the zoning that provides for overall density. There's a suitable sites inventory, which we've talked about. So that we're looking at reasonable build out. So we look at different constraints on sites. And then with the environmental review, we'll look at the actual build out citywide during the planning period and beyond for this. So we are going to 2035 with our EIR, so that's beyond the housing element cycle, to match up with what the goal was for our climate action plan, which is net neutral by 2035.
Thank you so much. That answers a question between 2031 and 2035. What happens then? Is it, okay. And I really want to emphasize that, yes, we've already met the zoning cycle needs for 6 cycle. We just need to decide where and what kind of housing, what type. Okay. How are demolished units counted in the RENA? Like, well, we've lost 80 units by some counts. How does that factor into the calculations?
So we do reporting every year to the state, and it's netted out. Every demolished unit is netted out.
Okay, thank you. I think you answered this, but I want to make sure in the PIR and the scoping, there's no project alternative listed or multi-unit housing project. Is that something that comes later, or?
Yes, we'll be working out the alternatives. We are required with the EIR to look at a no project alternative. So it's a little different in our situation because we have the average unit size density incentive program, which would expire in 2024. So we would have to look at that in the EIR, status quo at least. And we have had some direction from City Council in 2019 specifically about downzoning some potential historic district areas and Milpas area and upzoning some other areas. So we do want to analyze all of that so we can adopt any policies or implementation within that range.
Thank you. And then the existing infill guidelines that we adopted in 2017, are those already incorporated in, or would those be overridden by whatever comes forward in the housing element?
The design guidelines are currently effective.
Okay, so not the design, but the infill, the overlay, yeah, okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And then just how to take into account the nexus between more units built that are above moderate and the increased demand or need then for lower income, and how we're factoring that into our actual goals.
We do have a small contract. BAE is working with us, and they have experience with analyzing the Florida lot area ratio program. So we know this for this community. This isn't really anticipated by HCD, so it is something that's known here and that we will be looking at in the housing element.
I'm sorry, did you say FAR? Because we're not really looking at FAR anymore.
Our consultant that helped us with economically analyzing the FAR program is helping us with the housing element.
Okay, I do have some concerns about that since we've never seen a presentation from them, but okay, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Wardlaw.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff, for this presentation. And thank you all for your comments and questions, because that's been quite helpful. My main question is just taking a step back. When I look at these numbers, it seems that we're failing very tremendously in 3 out of the 4 categories. So I'd like to understand what is the difference in approach that we're taking to these goals as opposed to in the past that's going to set us up for better success. And additionally, is staff and council interested and willing to pursue more creative options to addressing some of the issues that we've heard today, like when we'd like to see something be a housing development, but it's then being penciled better for a hotel? If we're interested in trying to encourage developers to do something different than a hotel, is council and staff interested in doing more development agreements and really working with developers to identify ways to work around or within the zoning and restrictions that we have, but that we can work together so that we don't have more hotels going up in lots that could be perfect for housing developments?
Commissioner Wardlow, just a couple of things. Ms. Brooke may have some to add. As part of the early exercise of the housing element update, we're analyzing our 2015 housing element and all the goals and implementations for that. But we're also looking at government and non-governmental constraints. So we're looking at permit processes, we're looking at cost of processing permits. So those will inform our new policies. So the goals we're proposing are similar to previous goals. So the devil's in the details. It's how we get there with policy to actually get production. So those conversations will come. And yes, we're open to creative solutions for sure.
I'll just add, Commissioner Wardlaw, and to that point, as mentioned, new with this housing element cycle is having to be very specific with our programs, given timelines and staff resources and who's responsible for doing it. So we have to be intentional when we're creating these programs, whereas now, I believe Ms. Deisty said we have over 100 possible implementation actions to consider. So we can't be that loose going forward. So as we evaluate what hasn't worked in the past and we think about how we can plan for this new housing over the next 8 years, we'll need to be very intentional about it. And so with that, more likely to actually implement the programs.
Okay, great. I guess my question is, if I have a real interest in seeing more projects move through a development agreement process, if they're getting held up because there's not a path and then it turns to a hotel instead of a house, can we get this either as a goal that we're pursuing more innovative solutions, or is there going to be an emphasis that we as either council or the public generally can come and say, hey, let's look at this and do a development agreement instead of doing, just letting it go into another direction just because the current zoning doesn't work for us? Like, do I need to create a new goal, or would that fit under an existing goal?
Good question, Commissioner Wardlaw. And I would say it could fit under Goal 1. I'm not sure if there's one that speaks specifically to the process. It might be something that comes out of Goal 1. And I'd suggest that rather than using one-off development agreements to try to get through the process, that we just create the zoning and the standards and the process that actually makes it more expeditious to produce the housing than those agreements. So that would probably come out of policies and programs under Goal 1, I believe.
Thank you for your feedback, and I definitely agree. I just feel that we should emphasize new ways of going about this if we haven't gotten, to me, I'm like shocked by these numbers. Like, this is really scary because we're failing, right? Like, really, really failing in the 3 main categories that matter. And so if we're just giving lofty goals again, I want to make sure we have real ways to get them done. Thank you.
Commissioner Balke.
Mr. Mayor and Chair Zoedo, I've got a couple questions for staff. First one is the League of Women Voters had a number of modifications to your goals. Do you have any comment, response to what they're proposing? I've found many of those modifications to be very positive. What's your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Commissioner Balke. I recall I read the letter yesterday, and my no real opposition. My only comment on it is some of them, I think, maybe got into programs a little bit, maybe too specific in terms of the language used that might naturally come out of policies and programs. But I'm not sure if Mr. Gullett or Dicey or Ms. Dicey have any comments on the specific wordsmithing. It was just more the level of specificity for a goal was my only pause there.
The second question I have, and this is sort of a big picture and a feedback loop. I understand that most of the cities in California that have recently submitted their housing elements have had them denied. What is the issue? What can you tell us about that, and how can that be dealt with up front here so we don't run into the same trap?
Mayor Rouse and Commissioner Bauke. So you're correct, there was a recent cycle for Southern California area governments. And I believe 7 housing elements were certified and the rest were not certified, which puts them in a bind to create a certified housing element. And it also means if they do have to rezone, they have to do it very quickly. So we're doing the best we can to make sure when we do submit our housing element, it will get certified. It's hard to know right now for our area, because nobody's submitted yet, if we're going to be in the same bind as Southern California area governments. But this has been happening up and down the state, and to the point where some jurisdictions are talking to the state legislature and seeing if there's any remedy for this, because we can't have, hundreds of housing elements out of compliance. It's not going to help anybody. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen to our area when we all submit our housing elements, but everyone's scrambling to get them done and to do them legally compliant.
Do you know what the issues that are they running into? I mean, I think we need to learn from that experience so we don't run into the same buzzsaw, and that was the point of my question.
Yeah, Commissioner Bauke, I agree. And we have, HCD posts all the letters that they submit to the jurisdictions, and so you can read them and see where they fell short. Some of them have been struggling with the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements. That's a new requirement. It's pretty extensive, so that's something we'll take a close look at. Some have been failing on their public outreach efforts, and I think we've been doing a really good public outreach job so far. We're meeting with, on average, 2 to 3 groups per week and talking about the housing element update. In some cases, it's just HCD is questioning their zoning capacity and the numbers that they produced. It's all over the board on what they've have not met for compliance. But we are taking a look at those letters and we'll be using them as we move forward to make sure we hit the mark.
Okay, thank you. I only have one. It's a comment and a question. Last night when I was reading through this, one thing that just jumped off the page to me is the lack of a funding source, in talking about that as a goal statement. So I'm going to withhold all my comments on that so we can keep moving. But that was my assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Bonderson.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see you all. I have a couple questions that are going to piggyback off of others, and there's always such a huge advantage of going later because so many of the questions have been asked. But I wanted to follow up with the thought having to do with the moratorium on hotels, disincentivizing future construction of new rooms for hotels. And I was interested to know more about the potential of rezoning or modifying in some fashion the hotel overlays. Can we create hotel overlays? Has that ever been done before? Or is it something that you would consider doing as staff?
Mayor Rouse and Commissioner Bonderson, it's something we could look at. So hotels are allowed in most commercial zones, and then down in the coastal zone, very explicitly allowed in certain zones. And housing is allowed in most zones except the industrial zone. So we could, as a policy or program, look at creating some more intentional zoning in certain areas to make it more lucrative to develop housing.
I would love to see that happen, and hopefully we can discuss that consideration further. My next question has to do with the short-term vacation rentals and expand that to second homes, to homes that sit vacant much of the year without any type of use. And I wanted to know if there are any avenues that we currently have in place that would allow us to certify the occupancy in a certain way that requires owners to use those units in different ways than they are currently using them. So they're not sitting empty and they're not used for potentially for vacationers, bringing them back to local use.
Commissioner Bonderson, it's been mentioned earlier today, the idea of a vacancy tax. So somehow taxing owners of homes that might be a second home or a vacation home or not occupied full time throughout the year. So that's something we can explore. Also, just if they're illegally, renting them out as short-term rentals, that's another whole avenue to try to bring some of those back into full-time occupancy as well.
I'm going to develop this question a little bit further. I wanted to also talk about ADUs and the encouragement of potentially having more SB 9 projects in the future. Is there ways that we could permit those with some type of certificate of occupancy that doesn't only require them to be occupied, but to really emphasize how the rent level may be attached to them, make them required to be rented to a certain housing type, and to really help support having them sit empty or use them in rental ways for vacationers. Do we currently have anything being used now for ADUs and for potential incoming projects for SB 9? And how can we enforce it? Is there a way to add that to the permitting process?
Commissioner Bonderson, so for accessory dwelling units, there is a part of state law prohibits them from being used as short-term rentals. So that's already in there. Now that's just an enforcement matter, whether or not they are actually being used as short-term rentals. Similarly, for AUD units, they are intended to be used as long-term rental housing for the life of the project as long as it lives at AUD densities. So I think what you're asking about is just the enforcement of the existing laws. I'm forgetting the first part of your question. Oh, another thing is, our response to ADU and SB 9 legislation was very reactive and quick. So what we have in place on those two matters were done largely in response to state law. If we want to look at approaching those types of developments differently in a more methodical way, then we can look at that as a potential policy or program going forward.
Mayor Rouse and Vice Chair Bonderson, I just wanted to point out that in our SB 9 ordinance, we do restrict at least one of the lots has to be restricted to, help me, Ms. Brooke, is it moderate or low? I can't remember.
I believe it's low in the coastal zone and moderate inland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ostringer, and thank you, Ms. Brooke. You actually took some of the words right out of my mouth. I'm happy to hear that we may be able to consider modifying the approach for both ADUs and short SB 9s to make more opportunity. I'd love to have that considered here today. And as far as an enforcement mechanism, I know that tends to be somewhat of the problem when we find short-term rentals in our community. They're not all running with business licenses. Can we add that to some of these goals so that there is an enforcement effort to bring more into compliance and have more housing stock?
Commissioner Bonderson, I might defer to the attorneys on whether or not we would put as a policy or program anything that ties staffing or resource level to enforcement matters.
Thank you.
So, there we go.
Mayor Rouse, Vice Chair Bonderson, wouldn't tie the goals to that, and the city attorney has a discretion on how and when we prosecute cases, and we have an active prosecution team through Mr. Way, and so we do look at that. We take them very seriously.
Excellent. Thank you. Moving forward, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the missing middle, the moderate category that we saw on the screen in that chart earlier. And I wanted to mention that the listed goals don't address the specific housing type. However, I did hear Ms. Brooke and Mr. Gullett discuss the fact that they're trying to keep the language vague. I just want to make sure that we address in some format the idea that there's a number of people within our community that simply don't fit into the affordable housing category. They might miss it by just a little bit. And how do we make sure that we have enough, I have to think about how I want to phrase this, excuse me. For those who may not be eligible to fit into that assistance category, that new funding mechanism that we have been discussing here today, I'd like to see that it, works towards the moderate income as well. And so my question to Ms. Brooke is, or Mr. Gullett again, is with regard to that moderate category, if we don't see that term defined in the goals, are we going to be able to make sure that we cover them? Or do we need to verbalize it?
Yes, Commissioner Bonderson, I'd see that coming out of Goal 2 as a policy that gets more explicit about certain household types or income levels of households that we are prioritizing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That concludes my questions, and I appreciate the feedback from all of you.
Thank you. And I want to try to facilitate this last part of the meeting slightly because we need to be mindful that the goals that were stated by staff are very broad for a reason. And to try to wordsmith them here today probably may not be productive, especially if we go into different directions. So we really want to engage Planning Commission to get as much input and as much facilitation on planning as possible going forward with policies. But today, of course, we have to move forward on our housing element goals. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck, and we could wordsmith all day long when we do that. So please be mindful of that as we go through our deliberations. I'm going to turn this over to Chair Escobedo.
Thank you, Mayor Rouse. So we could do it in a similar format, or and we'll start with Commissioner Lodge if you're ready, and then move down the line with comments and suggestions.
Okay, thank you, Chair Escobedo and Mr. Mayor. A lot of what I'm concerned about will be things that can probably fit in the existing goals, but I'd like to make them, emphasize them. The rest of you probably read Nick Welsh's article back in November in which he pointed out that the number of new vacant houses dwelling units exceeded the number that had been built. Well, according to the census was off, and staff's working on this by about 100%. But it is something that made me look at what the percent of vacant homes was in the past, and to see, if the percentage has changed, and it has. Between 1970 and 2000, the vacancy rate ranged from 3.9% to 5.2%. In 2010, it was up to 6.3%, and 2020, it was 7.3%. Now, a 1% increase doesn't sound like much, but that represents 454 units, housing units, that disappeared from, from use by by those who live here. And a year ago, I looked at the VRB and Airbnb websites, and they said, I think they both said they had 300 listings on the South Coast each. And I think that's where a lot of them are going. And another portion is going to second homes. They no longer, by the way, say how many units they have, how many listings they have. Chair Escobedo has done a lot of research on what other cities have done. I think we need a more effective ordinance regulating short-term vacation rentals so we can reclaim some of this housing for people who live here. And all over and Councilmember Gutierrez has really seen it in his district, where neighborhoods that used to house blue-collar workers, Latino families, they're all VRBO now. And we've got to put a stop to that as much as we can. What I'd like to see is, to reclaim a separate goal, or how this might be included in the existing goals, reclaim existing housing now occupied by visitors by adopting an ordinance that effectively regulates and limits short-term vacation rentals and the sale of shares of homes as second homes. That last part is a new scheme that's come up, and where houses are being sold in shares for those who can't afford an entire second home. The other big issue is generating revenue and whether it needs to be for the construction of housing for very low, moderate, middle income, and special needs households by adopting an ordinance establishing a tax on vacant homes dedicated to the construction of capital A affordable housing. So, and I was surprised and very pleased to hear that the city can adopt a moratorium on new hotels, and I think that's something else that should be pursued. Just where it fits into the goals, I'm not sure, but those are my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge. Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to stick to the goals that we have in front of us. I think there's a lot of good ideas being generated here, but I think a lot of them belong in our policies that follow. The goals should be broader, and then we develop policies, and council might implement some of them that help us reach our goals. So I'm, with the risk of doing a little wordsmithing, I would like to do a little wordsmithing, Mr. Mayor. So what I heard from Ms. Brooke today, which I thought was really interesting, was assign a new requirement by HCD is to assign income categories per site. So I looked at goal number 1, and it's to create new housing. Well, really developers create new housing for the most part, not the city of Santa Barbara. We hopefully partner and encourage, but so I would like to see us have that goal as encourage production of housing within our resources. I think that was Councilmember Sneddon's comment, that meets community needs in safe, livable, and sustainable neighborhoods. And the reason why I say that is because I think if we are actually assigning income categories per site, we need to look at our neighborhoods. And so that's where I'd like to go with that. In goal number 2, I got my hand slapped because I had a conversation with Mayor Pro Tem Harmon about deed restricted, but I do think that is too specific here, and I think we're seeing other ways. AIA mentioned that we really eliminate the number of units, the number of dwelling units per acre, and that we allow developers to, maybe they want a building with all micro units, I don't know. But, so in goal number 2, I would say prioritize housing opportunities for all without discrimination while emphasizing development of affordable housing for very low, and moderate income households, which all gets defined in the housing element. I didn't have any comments on goal number 3. I think that is partly related to a partnership and the policies with the Housing Authority and others, and I think that there's a lot of ways to accomplish that through policies. Goal number 4, it uses the word retain existing affordable housing. Well, again, the city doesn't necessarily own the existing affordable housing, so I would say encourage retention of existing affordable housing and implement policies that discourage or protect tenant displacement. I think that's kind of where I go with that. On goal number 5, preserve housing. Again, it may be owned by a developer who doesn't want to preserve it, but establish and enforce policies that prevent blight or deterioration, promote occupancy, and discourage conversion to other uses. And in goal number 6, it says inform the community. I think it should be engage the community, not inform the community. I didn't have any comments on goal 7, but listening to everyone here, coordinate with regional partners. That should be coordinated with local agencies like the City Housing Authority and regional partners, and then coordinate with local agencies and with surrounding communities. I think if we add that, we can start to develop partnerships here too. And then I just had 2 more goals. I think we need a goal that gives measurable outcomes of our housing element at established intervals. I think that's really important. Councilmember Sneddon brought up this cycle 5. You know, where are we? How did we do? So I would propose a goal number 8, define housing policies that include measurable outcomes at established intervals. And I added another goal because I've heard from quite a few people about the process in developing their ADUs, accessory dwelling units, within their unit now. So in other words, they're not extending or building out. They're creating an ADU within their unit. And one particular person told me, applied in December, it's April, doesn't have a planner, hasn't heard a word. And the plans were submitted in December. So I think goal number 9 should be remove or ease governmental constraints for maintenance, improvement, and or development of housing. And that's pretty much my comments on my wordsmithing. And I apologize, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. We'll skip over me and go to Commissioner Wardlow.
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe, for your comments, as I really agreed with a lot of the language suggestions that you made, specifically around goal number 2 and goal number 4. I thought those were really good additions, so thank you. My comments go back to two things. One, on the funding stream and the great presentation that Rob Fredericks gave. I'd really love to see that as an additional goal. I think it's clear that, you know, the progress that we have not made in the 3 categories that need the most work would be best benefited by the work of the Housing Authority, and it would make sense that, especially given the TOT tax and how this is proposed, that we make sure we have a real funding stream to address this moving forward. So I'd love to see that as part of as an additional goal. And then separately, I feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse with this, but I'd really like to see somewhere an emphasis on creative solutions, so that I know that, you know, I can work with staff and that our team here is willing to come to the table with a developer and say, okay, what can we do to make this some housing affordable? I mean, I think at the 7-Eleven example on Milpas is a great example of how a development agreement came together, and then at the end of the day, we did get some affordable housing units in that, and that was going to go sideways. So really just emphasizing that that's a tool in our tool chest that we can utilize, and that staff is willing to do that. That's my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Worther. Commissioner Bauke?
Commissioner Zebaido, I've got an observation and then some comments. My observation of affordable housing in this community is it's always going to be a hard problem, but we have continued to put incentives into the system, which all it does is actually raise the land value to the landowner, not necessarily solving the problem and getting affordable housing back. So I'm suggesting that we actually sort of take a step back and actually look at sort of what your current zoning allows, separate from our other incentive programs, and find out what the land values are. And from there, do an analysis of what these additive things that we are proposing, may it be the elimination of density caps and things like that, due to the land value, and make sure we get corresponding affordable housing for those incentives. What that can be done through a number of mechanisms, but it's something that we're going to keep having a problem, because on the market side of it, you've got demand, it's not going to go away. So the only way to do this is through, capital A, affordable housing, and to make sure that's a good component. The chart that we saw here as to how effective we've been, and it's been my experience, I'm a land development consultant. I've run millions of units through performance, and the situation is a low and very low is something the public agencies have to do through funding mechanisms. There's just no way you're going to get the private sector to do those, because it's just the cost differential is too large. So we will need to come up with a funding source, and the folks from the Housing Authority put a couple suggestions. I have a few more. I think one thing we have to do is actually establish some kind of land value capture approach, maybe assessment districts, benefit assessment districts, enhanced infrastructure districts. So you basically need to recapture any of these things in which you give projects, increase the values to the landowner. You need to get at least some of that back and then funnel that back through a financing mechanism. So I think we need a goal 8 that really focuses on financing. May it be a TOT tax increase, may it be an additional fees on Airbnbs, may it be a vacancy tax, may it be all the above and a land capture mechanism, but we need to come up with a way, or even a foundation or even a banking mechanism. But we need to find a way to funnel public money into those lower categories to be able to actually accomplish something, because we're not going to get there if we don't do that. The private sector will build the moderate plus and a moderate above, and that can be done. And we can give them incentives to do that. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bauke. Vice Chair Bonderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said before, it's always interesting to go last or close to last because so many of my thoughts have already been developed so well. And so I'm going to do my best not to go into any detail on things that my fellow colleagues have already expressed, but I do want to give a little credit where credit is deserved. I want to just mention, I stand very strongly with Commissioner Lodge on the idea of reclaiming existing housing for people who live here. And I couldn't have said it better, so I would definitely refer to her language with regard to potentially adding another goal specific to this issue. I do want to stand in agreement with everyone who's talked about increasing the TOTs, adding or increasing vacancy tax, other types of enforcement to make sure that we are enforcing any type of empty unit or unit that's not being used for our local people here. And so in my opinion, it's really important to restrict and enforce anything happening illegally with short-term rentals. I know that we have a mechanism in place. I think that we need to increase the regularity on how often we check and really make it more difficult and eventually impossible to continue this type of use. I'd also like to encourage continued incentivizing methods for vacant units, not just putting a tax, but let's get those rented. Let's get those put to use. To wrap that idea up, I also want to go into the hotel idea that we've all talked about, but I really stand strongly with this idea of the moratorium, and many of the council members have discussed ways of approaching that immediately. I'd also like to consider stricter zoning to limit hotel development, bring more opportunities for housing opportunities in those zones by simply removing the opportunity to put hotels where possible, where appropriate. I would like to also continue the discussion on the funding, new funding streams. Mr. Fredericks and the Housing Authority did an amazing presentation. The research is extremely valuable. We're onto something here. And I'm hoping that we can develop that into its own goal. I think it's very important for it to stand alone. I would also like to see the term adaptive reuse put into writing somewhere. I believe Ms. Brooke mentioned that it would very likely belong in Goal 1, but I'd like to see it in writing so it's not just implied. I think that it needs to clearly be included as a form of development that we need to tap into a lot more. We have lots of opportunities with adaptive reuse. With regard to the moderate housing, I know that we talk so much about affordable housing. It is our top priority, and I stand in agreement. But I don't want to forget about the moderate group. So I don't know if that needs to just be constantly, in our minds that we need that type of housing as well. Since there's so many of us that don't fit into certain eligibility criteria for the affordable housing, but we don't want to lose that group and have them forced to leave our community. I would like to also tip my hat to Commissioner Wiscombe. I also had the idea of a timeline goal, and she expressed it so well. I think we do need to have a goal that holds us accountable to the work that needs to take place. Measurable outcomes with established intervals where we continuously check in, and if it's not working, then we revise our plan and keep moving forward diligently. I also really appreciated Commissioner Wiscombe's idea about expediting and easing the permitting process. I don't know if it requires its own goal, but I don't think it would be a problem to have that language in our housing element. I'm also interested in the idea of the development agreement and providing more options to work together with developers to create what we need and find ways to get them on board with serving the needs of our community. And lastly, I'll just wrap up by saying that I want to make sure as a public servant that we don't all work so hard and put all of this effort in only to lead us to continue in an ongoing cycle of never really getting to where we want to go. So I'm really glad that we had this conversation today. I think it was extremely valuable to hear new approaches that haven't been listed before, and to have these opportunities to discuss and hopefully codify these new ideas into practice. So thank you very much for the time. Mr. Chair?
Thank you, Vice Chair Bonderson. And I will quickly go through my comments before passing it back to Mayor Rouse. And I just want to start by saying I'm really excited about this housing element process. I think this has the potential to be really effective for our community. You've heard a lot of really innovative ideas today, and I'm excited to talk about those. But as it relates to the goals, for goal number 1, I liked Commissioner Wiscom's suggestion on wording. On goal 2, I prefer to keep the deed restricted in that goal. I think we do need to put an emphasis, as Commissioner Balke had mentioned, if we are going to do well in the income categories that we have been deficient in to this point, we really do need to prioritize deed restricted housing. Goal 3 looks okay. Let me see. For goal 7, I would suggest adding language in there that we would coordinate with regional partners or local agencies. I like that term. I would say also our state representatives. I think the state did a disservice to our city and other jurisdictions in taking away housing funding. When the redevelopment agency went away, we lost a big chunk of housing funding, and I think we need to lobby our state representatives to bring that back. I like Commissioner Wiscom's idea of really making this objective and evaluating our housing element on regular intervals. I don't know if it needs to be a goal, but it definitely should be a part of the process. I think waiting until we're at the end of a cycle and we're starting a new one doesn't make too much sense. Goal 9, that Commissioner Wiscom had proposed, I really like the spirit of it. I worry about the wording, and I didn't jot it down too much, but I worry about it conflicting with the spirit of Goal 4. So the spirit of Goal 4 is to retain existing affordable housing and discourage tenant displacement. And I forget about the wording in your Goal 9, Commissioner Wiscom, if you could repeat it.
I think I understand your point. Remove or ease governmental constraints for maintenance, improvement, and/or development of housing. And it really related to the personal comments I've gotten about ADUs more than anything. And I know that the city's working towards, making the process go more smoothly, but I guess I understand what.
But maybe there's a way for us to wordsmith it so that we can meet the spirit of both, because I've heard similar stories as well, and it is definitely something that we need to address. And then my last comment is I agree with the comments that were made today. We need a separate goal that we need to identify as many sources of funding for affordable housing. And we heard a lot of innovative ideas today. There are a lot more out there, and we need to take advantage of every one. If we really want people who live here, work here, to be housed here, we have to do it with partnering with the Housing Authority, partnering with other nonprofit developers. Private developers, they're going to develop, but it's going to be market rate. And I really think that we need to put an emphasis on that and continue lobbying our state representatives. I have no hope for the federal government. But with that, I will turn it back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, real quickly, just to recap, as I looked in and listened to all the comments, I saw very few that actually didn't fit in somewhere into the broader goal. So I don't know that we need to get into granularity to get forward today to give staff a path forward, including the financing mechanism with that is, I think, is part of Goal 3. So, or can be incorporated that way. And the ideas here were great. Commissioner Balke came up with the idea of even surveying land values and whatnot, which I thought was fabulous. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. But then I don't know, I'll ask staff, did you hear of anything that really couldn't fit into the categories you've already outlined in your broader goals today. I really didn't. I heard some interesting pathways, but I think they could all fit under the umbrella of what you've laid out today for us. Am I correct in that?
Mr. Mayor, I agree. For the most part, the one that might, if we want to emphasize it as a community, is identifying a continuous source of funding for affordable housing.
Right, but once again, that could be part of goal 3. I mean,
It could be if we expanded that. That's more about housing assistance. That's trying to keep people in their existing homes, providing wraparound services, trying to get people who are unhoused into homes. So it's a little bit different.
okay, well, maybe that can be expanded. I would just trying to keep it simple enough to give staff something to move forward on so we can get our housing element in within our time frame that we need to do. We'll go back to council deliberations. Once again, we've got a time crunch here, so please keep them brief. And I'll start with Mr. Jordan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me be the first to disagree with you. I would actually, I heard so many nuances today that I'd actually like to see this come back again, if that works within the timeline of what you're doing, because I'm not certain that I really have a clear understanding of what was programs, what was goals, and they're mixed up. Staff has spent enough time with me to know that I chafe under the whole goal process, and I just want to get to programs. I want to get going, and they got to tell me, no, that's coming a couple stages later. So I would actually appreciate having this come back to council with reaction and responses to what you've heard today and how those fit into the goals, and that you can actually validate that some of the things you heard fit within a goal and why, or why we should have a new goal that does address those things, or why we shouldn't. And this is one of the reasons I sit next to this young lady, is because she's a great wordsmither. And so I generally base that foundation on everything she started with today. And then I just kind of generally have some, big picture, I'm fine with the goals, but I think there's plenty I heard here today that I would like to hear again once staff has time to think about them. So big picture, I just have some other comments I'll just run through really quickly. You know, every time we talk about this, I still just view this whole process as an academic process rather than a process that recognizes that there's a real impact to lives and community members out there. And I don't say this in a negative way to staff, because it is an academic process for staff, but I just see a disconnect is probably a too strong of a word, but an end result that is a disconnect between the whole policy and development process and then our scorecard. I mean, I think you heard it down the way a little bit. Our scorecard's horrible, so why are we doing the same thing again? Well, the answer is because we have this academic process that we're required to go through every 8 years. Well, what can we do better on that academic process to make the scorecard better? And that, I think, clearly rests with 7 people that would be sitting up here that aren't all here today, and the political will to drive the results of the process. And I don't know that we're all in agreement on that political will, or that we've taken the opportunity to express that political will in a way that makes the report card look better. At the end of the day, a majority of the 7 of us can tell the city administrator, bring back a plan to do X in 6 months, and let her walk back and say, well, here's why I can, here's why I can't, here's where it's legal, here's what's not, and let us work through that. But I kind of just see that councils just kind of hand that off and then eventually live with the report card again, and we start the whole conversation over again. So that's kind of my overarching view on the whole process. I think, given the report card, I'd like to see us re-review existing zoning constraints, particularly on Milpas, where I know we changed those. We reduced those. Upper De La Vina, Upper State. Somebody talked about La Cumbre today, and you can talk about across the street on State and opportunity sites where opportunities exist that meet all the zoning requirements except one, density, and can't be done. But we're going to, right across the street from that, we're working on a enormous density project. And I think we need to look for ways to make the report card better. If that really means walking around and looking for spot locations that don't bother people, that don't get in the way of fill in the blanks of all the things you want to, mountain views, neighborhood compatibility, parking, traffic, whatever they are, but somehow are sitting in this broad paintbrush of a zone that won't allow it, and you can't even hardly get there because we don't allow the density. I think that needs to be addressed. I also think we need to revise the relationship between design and density. Continue to allow the full gamut of the design process and the slog that is, but then get out of the density process. Once that building has gone through this room on what it's going to look like, they've made the findings that used to be up there on the wall somewhere. Then let's not tell the developer what they're, and I'm talking about rental housing, let's not tell the developer what's going inside that building. Let the developer bear the burden for building something that he knows the market will react to and bear that responsibility, while also putting minimum densities on those opportunities so that we don't get larger units. We do get the smaller units that we're looking for. I agree with everything you've heard about the hotels. I'm frustrated on Garden Street. I'm frustrated on Yananoli Street. I would like to see that when we have zoning that allows for both hotels and apartments in the same place, that we incentivize the heck out of apartments and we decentivize the hotels. And I don't really see necessarily a moratorium being the right avenue, but I'm open to that. But what I really see is burdening a hotel with impact fees that are just enormous, and those impact fees go to a funding source of all these other funding source opportunities we're talking about. So somebody really wants to put a hotel there, then they're really going to contribute to the development of both what we want as a goal and also their direct impact on creating more of a need for that. Then I also agree with, we have a disconnect between, and I've heard it here today, even sitting up here talking about this, policy versus enforcement. Everybody wants to enforce, but then who's going to do it and what it's going to cost? And we never do that. So we're all ready to go out and enforce on short-term vacation rentals. In fact, we could go out and do it, but it's going to cost money and we can't afford to do it. But I think what we're leaving on the table is inland short-term vacation rentals that are illegal. They're taking up housing. They're a current and backwards funding stream that would also be a funding stream when we're talking about funding streams. And I gotta just kind of think that with the mayhem in the coastal zone, that we're probably also leaving TOT payments in the coastal zone by people just kind of being ambivalent about where we are ambivalent. So, and then I just want to emphasize, closing comment, that again, there's 7 people who can steer this conversation with political will. And it's nice to set policies and then watch those policies come back 8 years later and see a report card like that and realize that, personally for me, I played a role in some of those policies in prior roles. And it's not really nice is what I'm saying, to see that report card come back. And I would encourage all of us to take a greater look in the mirror and play a better role in matching our personal political will and how we exert that with the policies that we've agreed to support. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Gutierrez?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll keep mine short. I agree with pretty much everything everyone said up here, and I agree with Councilmember Jordan's notion that we need to move quickly and more aggressively when it comes to making some of these things happen. And I look forward to meeting with each and every one of you in this room, and also who participated virtually in our new housing crisis ad hoc committee to try to help expedite these changes that we need to make to our community. Thank you.
Ms. Harmon?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I'm really going to try to confine my comments just to these goals today. I very much appreciate a lot of what I heard from Councilmember Jordan, and I agree with a fair bit of it, but I'm not going to talk about policy or program, though I would love to, but I won't. You're welcome, Mr. Mayor. So just a couple of things that I want to just highlight that are important to me, for whatever that's worth. On goal number 2, while I certainly agree very much with the need to focus our energies on capital A affordable, my point in trying to broaden this is that there may be more creative solutions to getting to that capital A affordable other than just deed restriction. And so to the extent that we are committing ourselves specifically in these overarching goals, I would like to make sure that we leave room, maybe we say deed restricted and other, or Commissioner Wiscombe, whatever you said when you read that thing, I loved that. But my point is not that I want us to change focus from capital A affordable or low income housing. I certainly do not. I want to make sure that we allow ourselves the latitude to utilize all the tools, whether we're talking about DAs, whether we're talking about something else, to achieve that goal. So just putting that out there, I'd like to see that broadened in some way while still maintaining what I think is the intent behind it, Ms. Brooke, as you said, which is to make sure that we're clear that that's a priority for us as a community. On goal number 4, Ms. Brooke, you mentioned maybe flipping the way this is framed so that discouraged tenant displacement comes first. Personally, I would like to see that. I think that gets to the heart of what this goal is a little more effectively and speaks to some of the concerns that were brought to us by the public commenters about making sure that renters are really centered in this conversation when we talk about promoting stability and sustainability in our housing community. So I am in favor of making that flip. Let's see, goal number 7, I also like the change that I heard just as I came back in to include local agencies. So giving my thumbs up to that. And then finally, I just can't strongly enough, I can't say strongly enough how supportive I am of including an additional goal for funding streams and funding sources. To the extent that we are thinking about this process and how we can get a better report card 8 years from now, it is just as clear as day to me that we cannot get a better report card unless we have funding sources, whether they're permanent, whether it's one time, all of it. We need it all. And I think that without that, we're really out to sea. So I would like to see that goal 8, and frankly, to the extent that these goals are prioritized in terms of importance, like 8 is the least important or whatever, we may even want to move it up and make it goal 3. So I just really, really would like to see that included. That's very important to me. And my appreciation to staff who's doing a huge amount of work to get us here. I know this is no small undertaking, so thank you. And sorry, last thing, I would love to see it again too, if that's something we can make work, even informally in informal meetings, that would work for me as well. Just an opportunity to sort of follow along would be great. I'm sorry to add to your workload. Thank you.
Sned.
Thank you. These goals are so important, and I think it sets the framework for everything that comes after. So I think it's worth wordsmithing carefully. And also after that wordsmithing, I agree that I would also like to see it written out in written form to make sure we're all in agreement on what we heard, what is actually implemented until the next time we see it being the draft. So I do appreciate if we could see it again. I'm very concerned still that we have not thoroughly looked at the successes and failures of the last cycle in a deep dive. And I realize we'll do that as part of the process, but my preference really is to have that ahead of setting goals. It's very difficult to set goals for the next steps if you haven't thoroughly analyzed what worked or didn't work the last time around. And I think that can also help us improve our scorecard. I think we all have ideas about what could be improved or policies. We've heard some of them today. I will say that I agree with Councilmember Jordan that in looking more surgically at where these opportunities actually are, where they can actually be developed, and it's a very blunt tool to say this whole swath of area, go for it, give it a try, and for us to then, one at a time deny them. We need the right kind of housing. I cannot emphasize this enough. I think that is why we're failing in our lower income and moderate. I mean, we're killing it at the luxury units. I mean, 95%, great, but we are just completely failing at the other end of the spectrum. So to me, I make the conclusion that building for building's sake is not creating that downward pressure. So in terms of, since the mention of political will, I think it needs to be all handed to the Housing Authority and with complete emphasis on affordable, affordable, affordable. I just don't see why we're incentivizing anything else, frankly, especially the nexus between the every unit of affluent unit that you build creates that pressure and need for multiple other units of the lower income and moderate income level. And so you're breaking even then at some point or going negative if you just keep building above moderate and higher income units and you're not keeping up with that increased demand. We're actually going negative. And so I, again, emphasize that I just don't believe that building for building's sake, if it isn't the right kind of housing, is just not going to get us there. So goal for goal, I will just go through them quickly. Goal 1, I really think it needs to have the inclusion of within our resources. Again, because if we don't have that inclusion in there, if you're, there's this, IPAT equation that impact equals the population times the affluence times technology, and these are multipliers. So if your affluence is exceeding the lower income, then your environmental impact, your impact on resources, we have wastewater issues. We cannot ignore that Tahigas is going to be full before this next housing element cycle is over. And to not take into account our waste stream, and with affluence comes a much higher level of waste stream. So being within our resources, I feel like is essential, even though it's in other places. I think it needs to be specified in goal 1. I liked Commissioner Wiscombe's language, but I would like to retain in the old 2015 language that with special emphasis on housing needs that meet the needs of extremely low, very low, low, moderate, middle income, and special needs households. I'm not really seeing the benefit of excluding that, and from all the comments, it seems that that's where our emphasis is. So why take it out? So I like it better with that in. Goal 2, I also appreciate the wording of Commissioner Wiscombe. I would like to keep the deed restricted language, and the reason for that is that I do think that development agreements are an underutilized method of creating housing, and I want to explore that and promote that. But if we have the deed restricted as part of our goals, then in those development agreements, we can be referring back to that as, how many of those units are deed restricted, not just inclusionary for today, but how many can be deed restricted. So I'd like to continue with that. Goal 3, I approve as written. It's a new goal. It's a good goal. Goal 4, encourage retention of existing and encouraging policies. I did put in there identify consistent funding stream, but I like better to have it be its own separate goal. That's going to take quite a push, and I think it's absolutely the direction we need to go to. So having that be a separate goal is fine. I think in goal 5, I have a lot of issues with the word blight and with the changing of the wording from how it was to how it is being presented. My concern is that if our goal is to prevent blight, that there will be incentive to demolish naturally affordable units, or that blight might be considered an incentive for not replacing like for like. So I think if there is that in there, and plus the term is maybe a little bit dated, but I'm very concerned about the incentive then to remove blight. And I think that's where our naturally affordable housing unit is. But to Commissioner Wiscombe's comments about having be safe housing and suitable housing needs to be retained. So I would add to Commissioner Wiscombe's that on Goal 5 to save and use fully the housing that we have. My goal towards that is things like replacing like for like, or encouraging rehabilitation loans, or adaptive reuse. I like the terminology of reclaiming housing, and that also relates to policies of, impact fees on second homes, or replacing like for like, limiting hotels, limiting STRs, adaptive reuse, including looking at the impact of demand for new housing that's affluent with low income and affordable, and then regulating the STRs, which maybe I already mentioned in there. But reclaiming housing as a goal puts all of those in that category. We don't want to be losing housing, but we don't want to just break even. We want to be reclaiming those places that could be housing again, to save and fully use the housing that we have. And I really, the blight, so back to the old wording, if you add save and fully use the housing we have and take out the word blight, I think it's already there. So that would be my recommendation there. On Goal 6, engaging the community was a good change, and we really need to do this throughout this entire process, not just at the end of this and in implementing our goals, but through this entire process. Particularly, as was mentioned by public speakers, the input of tenants and renters, those who are impacted, and possibly also specific target for impact input from workers who work in our community but are unable to find housing, so potential tenants. The Goal 7, I also agreed with the Commissioner Wiscombe's comments and gave Commissioner Chair Escobedo's comments. And then, although I do think we could also leave it as it was, and it would accomplish the same goals there. Measurable outcomes, yes, I think it's probably in the goal of the new requirements that we have those, and I think we could set policy about the measurable outcomes, about how often we want it to return to Planning Commission and return to Council, to make sure it's an iterative process and a responsive document that's really looking at how is it working and not waiting for that. So I'm not sure it needs to be a separate goal, but I absolutely agree with a separate goal being a funding source. If we don't set it for a goal that we hold ourselves accountable to, I don't know that it'll have as high a priority. And I also think that's going to, affect our scorecard further down. On the goal of governmental restraint, I don't know that we need to put that in a goal. That may be policy that furthers our other goals, and we're working on that, and that's come out through studies, and we sort of already have a task force. And I worry that if we make that our goal, government restraint could be interpreted as deed restriction or other policies we're putting in place to try to promote housing. So I don't know that I want that to be its own goal. I think we've all talked about the different policies that'll come forward in there. I'm just going to highlight just a couple and I'll be finished. Limiting hotels, limiting vacation rentals, impact fees for second homes. We also need to be considering the impact to our historic resources that does translate to TOT. The environmental resources, clearly, I fully support the suggestions of the Housing Authority and thank them for always taking the lead on this. And I would support also additional streams of income. So I think we've set that forward in our goal. Vacancy tax, purchasing existing units for the city. Really, these development agreements, I think, can be very successful. I'm not sure that I would agree that the 7-Eleven was my example of a good outcome, but I think the La Cumbre and the potential there, hopefully that's working out. also commercial development impact fees, I think, maybe not in the period of time that we're in right now with businesses as they are, but the affordable housing overlay, I think we could really go far with a more surgical approach to where is it that we really are prioritizing affordable housing and make it happen. I'm not in favor of owner-occupied requirements on ADUs, just because that's an extension of somebody's home if they're occupied in it, and they might want to keep it vacant for a time or have it filled at different times, and that's maybe a more close-to-home decision, that just because you built an ADU doesn't necessarily mean you're ready at that time to occupy it yet. And then just the emphasis on community outreach, and I'm looking forward to the community's input on all of this, and I realize it's a little bit timeline, but we really do need the full engagement. It's only been 10 days since the scoping was approved, and so there is time to make these goals and set them. Thank you.
All righty then. I appreciate everybody's input and time today. Clearly, we got a little further into the weeds than was our intention, or maybe even staff's intention. From my personal comments, these are the ways that we have to go through to comply with the law. There's a fair amount, with all due respect with everybody, there's a fair amount of hubris in thinking we're going to actually create the things we're going to create because we made policies to create them. We've proven that time and time again over the years, and other than subsidized housing, or what I think is our very fabulous housing authority, there are certain categories we're going to fall behind on no matter how many of these meetings we have. But I realize we have to comply with the law and do what we need to do. And to that end, this is pretty clear. We're not going to come to a consensus right this moment. Ms. Bjork, can you comment on what we might do to bring this down to some kind of reasonable solution?
Mayor Rouse, you have a relatively light agenda on May 17th, and I think it would be appropriate, particularly given that two of your colleagues aren't able to be here today, that we return for the continued council deliberation on this. That will give staff a chance to come back with a presentation on what we heard, any recommended modifications to the goals, an explanation of how goals versus programs and policies work together to try and clarify a little bit around all of those elements, and a chance for the full council to have better deliberation. We are on a tight time schedule, as you're aware, but I think waiting those couple weeks, I am hoping, staff, that you can continue to do some of the work you need to do, because we've had some very good, strong themes that we've heard here today that have helped clarify where we do have consensus. And I think we're really talking around the edges, quite luckily, but they're big edges. So we're happy to return on the 17th.
Do we need to have a motion for that, or can we just go to the table?
I will
Mr. Mayor?
defer to our attorney, but I believe you need to continue this item to the 17th.
I was going to ask if we could continue the item and not have to reopen it for public comment, so we could just do deliberations. I would make that motion then, to adjourn this meeting until May 17th.
Second.
Okay, motion Jordan, second Sneddon. Okay, very good.
And just for those watching, to clarify, we did accomplish the planning commission portion of the input to council, so my expectation is we're adjourning the council meeting to the 17th.
Yes, ma'am.
That's correct. And, but I would, as a personal note, not only thank Planning Commission, but also if they want to submit comments to us before that meeting on your details. And I know Ms. Wiscombe has some. Thank you all. Appreciate that. And with that, what? Oh, we didn't take a vote yet. Why didn't we take a vote?
Never mind.
We can, what? You mean I was right the first time? We're out of here. Wait, do we need to vote to continue? We had a motion on the floor. Which one?
Okay.
Do that, bud.
It's a motion.
Call us out.
Almost done. This is a motion by Councilmember Jordan, seconded by Councilmember Sneddon, to adjourn the council meeting until May 17th. Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez is not present. Councilmember Friedman not present. Councilmember Sneddon.
Yes.
Mayor Potem Harmon.
Yes.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez.
Aye.
Councilmember Jordan.
Yes.
And Mayor Rouse.
Aye. And with that, we'll see you again on the 17th. Thank you, staff.